Hello, everyone, and welcome to Through Time and Clades. My name is Joan,
And I'm Albert.
and welcome back to our series on human origins, Humanity a Prologue. This time we are in episode 8, Becoming Homo sapiens. And we're going to talk a lot about the origin of our species as well as the subsequent Stone Age of Africa. But before we jump in, Albert, how are things with you?
Oh, I've been doing all right. I've been kind of busy with the usual things with research and yeah, mostly that really. But things have been relatively uneventful as goes major items to report. However, I do know this is a very special episode because in a sense, kind of your entire series has been building up to this point, hasn't it? Um,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so actually, with your permission, I wonder if I could sing a song to commemorate that.
Oh, please, by all means. I love your
Okay,
musical stylings.
okay. Let's see if I could do this in one take. Let me see. Ho, 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 Homo sapiens, we've a body shape that looks a lot like an alien's. And of all the species who are living today, we're the only ones who play croquet. Okay, let's take a closer look at the only living thing who can read a book. The only animals who choose to tattoo their own skin, and apart from elephants, the only ones with a chin. Let's glance askew at this brainy crew, although our brains are not as big per body weight as the tree shrews. We're the upright ape, whose backbone has uncurled, who for better or for worse can reshape its world. Ho, 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 Homo sapiens, we're the only ones who build spaceships and stadiums. But bear in mind, all bragging about how unique you are, you share half your DNA with a banana, and over 96% with a chimpanzee, and over 99.9% with me. And that's it.
Hey, is that uh um the Songlopedia guy?
Yeah, you're right. You're right on money. Yeah. That's John Hinton, who is a science communicator and musical performer who writes songs about science. And yeah, that one's from his show Encyclopedia of Animals, which is 26 songs about different kinds of animals. Um, but done in a way that you might not expect. Like he has one animal for every letter of the alphabet, but he does them in an order, like phylogenetically. So he starts out arbitrarily with humans. So that's the first song in his show, basically. But as he continues with the show, you start getting animals that are further and further, more distantly related to humans, until he ends with sponges. So it's a pretty fun show, and yeah, that was the first song in it, and it kind of gets across some of the ways in which humans are special among animals, but also some ways in which we're not so special. So I think it's pretty neat.
Yeah, that's awesome. I should really check that out at some point soon. But yeah, like I mean, gosh, this is really a special episode and a special time in more ways than one.
Yeah,
I guess updates on my end. I
sure.
have officially moved in to the apartment that I was telling you all about over the past couple episodes.
Yeah.
We close our old house on the 17th, and then we will be, well, for the most part, moved into the apartment. But there's still a lot of stuff to do. The way I the way I packed up my room, it took me about a day to just kind of get everything else once all the big furniture was in. But
Mm-hmm.
my folks have a lot of other stuff that they've taken from the house, all kinds of pictures and silverware and all this kind of stuff. And that's probably going to take about a month to set up.
Yeah.
But it should be okay. And this will be home for us for about a year and a half or so while their dream house is being built on the new
Mm.
land.
Wow.
So that'll be an ongoing project on
Right.
this next chapter of our lives. But I feel
Exciting.
very good.
Yeah.
Um, and it's been encouraging, like throughout like the past week, where the moving has really like kicked up a notch, like
Mm-hmm.
packing and carrying heavy things. In between, something interesting happened with our show.
Oh
Our
yeah.
popularity has really skyrocketed.
Yeah, you could say that, and it's really thanks to your last episode on Neanderthals, isn't it? It seems like a lot
Yes.
of people are discovering the show through it. and
Really?
currently over 1,500 views. So that is definitely a big jump from our usual count.
That's right. We passed the 150 subscriber mark, and we thank all of you viewers and listeners who've turned in over the years to help us get to this point. Um, I honestly have no idea out of all of our episodes that we've done why the Neanderthal one was the catalyst that just upped our viewer count because we're checking back our analytics and so forth, and like the views have just like risen and risen over the days,
Mm-hmm.
and people going back to the beginning of this series and starting from the very first episode, which is just really encouraging and reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help wonder the timing of it all. I have a hypothesis
Mm-hmm. Okay.
as to maybe why our Neanderthal episode was so popular. So last week, on March 2nd, of course, at the time of recording, the governors of Texas and Mississippi announced a lift on mask mandates,
Mm.
as well as an allowance for businesses to reopen back to 100% capacity.
Mm.
So a sort of go back to normal sort of thing. Um, which, of course, I shouldn't have to explain why that's probably very, very, very premature
Right.
at this point. And so the following day, on the 3rd, President Biden responded to the decision during this Q&A session with reporters, where he called it Neanderthal thinking on the part of the governors for opening up a greater risk of COVID-19 exposure.
Mm.
Now, a couple of things with that. One, it kind of goes to show like what I was talking about in the last episode, how these stereotypes and perceptions of Neanderthals that started, at the beginning of the 20th century and back
Mm-hmm.
are still around. The
Yep.
idea that these people were, these dumb, brutish cave people who didn't amount to much, and of course, we know that that's not true at all.
Right.
And so to kind of hear Biden say that kind of brings home the point that like this is still a misconception that must tirelessly, continuously be handled with.
Mm-hmm.
I know anthropology Twitter was a buzz about it, and common comment that I saw was, "Oh, we should send a copy of Rebecca Sykes' book to the White House." And you know what? Why not? I
Why
mean,
not? Yeah.
an anthropologically literate president would probably be a good thing to have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, like, that the timing of all of that kind of corresponds to like when the numbers for the
Mm.
Neanderthal episode started jumping.
Right.
I'm wondering if there's a situation where people heard this and somehow managed to come across our video on Neanderthals and their relatives, and we're like, huh, I wonder, what we do actually know about Neanderthals. And so watched through it and then just told all their friends and colleagues or what have you.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a pretty good guess, I think. But definitely, you viewers can let us know if that really was the case. How did you find our videos? And yeah, leave your comments below.
Absolutely, and we appreciate all of your recent comments too, as well. We're glad that we've been able to provide enjoyable and educational content to all of you, and it keeps us doing what we do and enjoying what we do every day. So
Definitely.
again, thank you so much. So I guess without further ado, why don't we jump right into our episode, shall
Sounds
we?
good.
All right. Now, as I've mentioned previously, today we're going to talk about finally the emergence of our species, Homo sapiens,
Mm.
currently the last surviving hominins on Earth. Our lineage has come a very long way to get here, but before you go thinking that we know everything about this part of the family tree, I am here to tell you that there are still some great mysteries that may prove very difficult to uncover.
Mm.
In this episode, we are also going to survey a part of human history that often gets put aside or even ignored in popular literature and media, and that's the Middle and later Stone Age of Africa.
Right.
Now, what I mean by this is that in your like traditional history narratives, whenever the evolution of Homo sapiens is brought up, Usually you hear about our African origins and maybe a little bit about the emergence of so-called behavioral modernity
Hmm.
before jumping straight into the out of Africa movements and the subsequent spread of Homo sapiens across the world.
Hmm.
And you never hear from Africa again until the Egyptians show up again
Right, right.
thousands of years later. But in between all that time, there's so much rich history that isn't talked about and should be talked about more. And so it's my hope that we can remedy this a little bit and answer some of your questions about what prehistoric Africa was like.
Wonderful.
So let's jump to the next slide here.
Cool.
In our usual manner, before we continue, there are some news and updates to cover, typical of human origins research.
Hmm.
First up, we have a new look at some old bones in a paper that I seem to miss from 2020. Going back to 2003, a small collection of hominin skull fragments was unearthed from the Olorgesailie Formation in Kenya, dated to about 900,000 years old. There was part of the forehead, including the brow ridge and upper orbits, some of the left temporal bone, and parts of the cranium. Now, these fossils were initially associated with Homo ergaster, or what the authors called African Homo erectus. But given the complexities of later research into hominin taxonomy and the fragmentary nature of the fossils, there grew uncertainty about the specimen's true nature. It didn't really seem appropriate to do a comparative approach with these fossils because they were so partial. That's where this particular study comes in. Using new computer technology, the authors of this paper created a virtual reconstruction of the fossil specimen, taking parts of the skull and mirroring them to give proper symmetry. And you can clearly see this in the image on the left. All the red areas represent the original specimen.
Hmm.
Then the authors looked at a big sample of fossils, including proper Homo ergaster as well as Homo erectus specimens, species from other hominin grains, including habilines and more derived hominins, including our species. And then they compared all these bones to the new reconstruction. And from here, the authors provide some interesting possibilities. Now, in looking at their PCA plots, it becomes clear that this Kenyan specimen is very different from Homo sapiens, as well as some of the mystery hominins from Eurasia and Africa, which I've dwelt on before and will do so again. So that's maybe not too much of a surprise. It does fall within the overall variation of African and Eurasian erectines, including Homo ergaster, and this is based on features of the skull. However, in terms of size, these remains show a very strong similarity to the Dmanisi hominids,
Hmm.
so-called Homo georgicus. Now, you may recall the discourse around these remains and how they might not have anything to do necessarily with erectines, but instead be more attributed to the habiline grade and a possible earlier expansion into Eurasia than the one that produced Homo erectus. That these remains are younger than the Dmanisi fossils and found within Africa then is interesting if there is a link there.
Hmm.
But the authors also point out similarities to none other than Homo naledi, which is the most recent phylogenetic studies show to be a derived erectine hominin. For that lineage, we really only have the fossils from the Rising Star cave system. We don't have anything indicative of possible ancestral forms that would make a clear case for relationships. Now, if better remains are unearthed for this Kenyan specimen, then maybe we have our first member of an otherwise mysterious lineage that eventually led to the evolution of Homo naledi.
Wow.
Yeah, so right now those possibilities remain open. We just need better fossils. But this further demonstrates the increasingly tangled patchwork of lineages that seems to make up the story of human evolution, and why it's
Right.
important to go back to some of these older described fossils and really compare them to what we know more completely. Albert, is there anything you'd like to add on this point?
Oh, not particularly, but it's true. Always more fossils is definitely welcome in our fields.
Absolutely. Um, Alrighty then. So then, this update is just here to kind of amend some discussion from the previous Neanderthal episode that was so popular. I had talked a lot about the discourse surrounding the extinction of the Neanderthals and a bit about the history of Europe around that time. I had mentioned evidence about a volcanic eruption from
Hmm.
Italy that might have played a role in making Neanderthal populations vulnerable to extinction. First of all, I should have been clear that, this volcanic episode is referred to in the literature as the Campanian Inimbrite eruption. So whenever you go into the literature, that's what I'm referring to. Secondly, I'm here to tell you that after listening to some discussion by actual Neanderthal experts on Twitter as well as in the literature, I've been able to dig a little bit more into that. It actually seems quite unlikely that volcanic activity played a role in the extinction of the Neanderthals.
Hmm.
As devastating as eruptions can be to human communities, and this is evidenced by, recent human history,
Definitely.
yeah, the evidence just kind of seems slim to none that prehistoric humans, including Neanderthals, were affected by volcanoes in such a way as to upend their lives and help wipe them out.
Hmm.
So at present, this isn't a popular hypothesis among the majority of Neanderthal workers, and it likely doesn't hold any water. Now, incidentally, this discussion piggybacked off a very recent and highly controversial paper that some of you may have seen, where there was, this episode in Earth's history where the magnetic field
Ah, yes.
flipped. Yeah, it flipped around 42,000 years ago, and this was supposed to be so major that whole species of animals underwent genetic bottlenecks, and the Neanderthals were doomed too.
Right, right.
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into it, but I'll just say that one of the authors behind that paper is a notorious individual who has done a lot of harm to his colleagues, and a lot of the data in this particular study was heavily fudged to fit his hypothesis.
Hmm.
To the point where, like, you go to the papers listed in the sources, and then you read them, and they say things completely different from what the authors of this paper say they do.
Wow.
Yeah, so no, the Neanderthals did not die out because of a magnetic field flip, and they didn't die out from a volcanic eruption either.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I like to let you all keep that in mind. But okay, let's move on back to our narrative to the next slide.
Alrighty.
So, what was Africa like when Homo sapiens evolved? During the Middle Pleistocene, while the Neanderthals, Denisovans, and their relatives enjoyed Eurasia, Africa was no less populated by related human species, and it was no less affected by the Ice Age. Now, the people who lived there may not have had to deal with giant ice sheets or cold tundra conditions, but they were not isolated from the changes that occurred in the north. It's important to understand that an ice age is a global event. Even if you live in a place where there's no ice, the Earth may be a complex system, but it functions as a single unit. So there's always changes that affect different parts of the world, no matter how far they are. During the interglacial periods, the ice sheets retreated in the northern and southern hemispheres, and the global climate would warm. Therefore, Africa was a warm and especially wet place, as it was often punctuated by monsoon rains from the Indian Ocean. Now, the link between the monsoon and the ice ages has been increasingly better known, even if the explanation for just why that is has yet to be clarified. But we know that, at least, the initiation of the Pleistocene ice ages coincided with the strengthening of the monsoon's intensity. Now, during glacial periods, when the ice sheets expanded, the global climate cooled and dried. For Africa, where much of the continent lies on the equator, the environment tended to get quite arid, and there was often big droughts that made life very difficult. In the Sahara and Kalahari deserts, this would have been very noticeable, but other more vegetated regions on the continent were not exempt. There was core data from a series of lakes along the Rift Valley, and in particular, I'm talking about Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika, that have shown that around 135,000 years ago, a mega drought commenced across much of eastern and southern Africa. And these lasted a very long time. They occurred in intervals of around 11,000 years, after which heavy rains would come to provide some comfort before the next mega drought.
Hmm.
And this period wouldn't cease until after 70,000 years ago. And it's events like these that have caused paleoanthropologists to consider how human history was affected. I mean, a drought so intense that it could turn a lake 550 kilometers long into a handful of 10-kilometer ponds,
Wow.
must have influenced human activities on the continent.
Right.
And many researchers see the timing of the latest mega drought, which began around 75,000 years ago, as the straw that broke the camel's back and caused some human groups to leave Eastern Africa for greener pastures in the few thousands of years after that time.
Hmm.
But of course, that's a discussion for the next episode. We know that humans in Africa made it through the droughts. There's no question about that. So there must have been pockets called refugia where they could have survived and found good food and water. There are a number of archaeological sites across this time showing human habitation near lakes, rivers, and coastlines, as well as caves, and these would have provided good resources for families. And their overall nature as refugia meant that many major deserts or drought stricken areas would have acted as barriers and then initiated genetic and cultural diversity. So, turning away from humans for a moment, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the animals of Middle Pleistocene Africa. Popular culture has already helped familiarize many people to the Ice Age animals of Eurasia and North America.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows about woolly mammoths and rhinos and cave lions and bears, Irish elk and bison. But a lot of Africa's wildlife during this time is often known only to specialists or
Mm-hmm.
paleo fans like Albert and I. And that may be because many of the current species that live in Africa today had evolved prior to the start of the Pleistocene. The African elephants, for example, were established in the earlier Pliocene. Zebras and wildebeest had been forming herds for over 2 million years. And hyenas have been hunting and scavenging here for around 10 million years. So a lot of these familiar safari animals are technically surviving Ice Age fauna. But this isn't the case for everyone. Many other iconic African animals, so lions, wild dogs, warthogs, they evolved very recently,
Hmm.
likely because they were replacing niches that were lost from previous extinctions. Paleontologists have noted a number of megafaunal extinctions occurring in Africa between 992,000 and 350,000 years ago, and the causes of these extinctions have been discussed for a while now, with proposed links being drawn to changes in vegetation due to periodic cooling of the African climate during glacial periods. But there is also an emerging consideration that perhaps non Homo sapiens hominins might have played some role due to better hunting techniques.
Hmm.
I alluded to this in an earlier episode. But in any case, we lost some really cool animals. There were these giant gelada monkeys that were almost a meter and a half tall.
Wow.
There was a hippopotamus with almost periscope-like eye sockets.
Hmm.
There was a big warthog-like pig with dual sets of tusks,
Hmm.
and there was a giraffe with moose-like antlers, just
Yeah.
to kind of bring up a few. Now, courtesy of paleo artist Viel Sinkonen, I've placed here 3 sketches of some of these extinct African animals, some of which did manage to hang on till the end of the Pleistocene. Now, at the top left is Pilarovus antiquus, a relative of the living Cape buffalo, but with a much wider spread of horns, and it's just a bigger animal overall. Uh, Incidentally, Darren Naish, again we bring him up a lot
Yeah.
at Tetrapod Zoology, he's talked about some interesting rock art from North Africa that may or may not represent this extinct species.
Hmm.
And we'll be sure to put a link in the description to check that out. Next up at the top right is Rusingorix, which you might know as a newly discovered animal.
Hmm.
But in my readings, we apparently knew about this species since the 1980s.
Hmm.
It's just that the initial fossils were not very good.
Right.
It wasn't until about 2016 that much more complete remains were found. And,
Yeah.
well, they've revealed some really cool nasal anatomy that might have helped these antelope make loud calls. These have been likened to the crests of some hadrosaurs, which probably had a similar function.
Hmm.
And finally, at the bottom is Megalotragus. Now, this is an extinct relative of the hartebeest. which you guessed it has big old horns. Apparently, horns were in fashion in the Pleistocene of Africa.
Yeah.
Apparently, although its head, as you can see here, would have looked like a living hearted beast, its overall body proportions were closer to a wildebeest.
Hmm.
This is a very unique looking animal.
Yeah.
But yeah, just like any other part of the world during the Ice Age, Africa had its share of weird and wonderful animals. And these would have certainly been the species that our lineage grew up with. Albert, is there anything you'd like to add about these folks?
Not too much, but yeah, definitely they are very underexposed in popular culture. And if I remember correctly, we actually covered the new discoveries regarding Rus and Gorix on Incidents and Reflections back when we were doing that.
Yeah, that's right. That would have been about that time, wouldn't it?
Yeah, 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 it would have been. So I think we mentioned it. So yeah, it's definitely I don't I haven't read very deeply into like antelopes and their kin, but definitely Rus and Gorix stands out as one of the very interesting and unusual ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Would have been interesting to see in real life to see what that call may have sounded like.
Right, right.
Yeah, I haven't even bothered to check the literature whether they've done similar things to those specimens
Oh yeah.
than what they did with like Parasaurolophus. Like,
Right, right.
do like sound studies. One wonders, the
Hmm.
sounds our ancestors heard on the African plains.
Yeah, indeed.
So let's jump to the next slide here, real quick.
Yep.
Before we move on, let's just get a sense of the human fossil record during the Middle Pleistocene. As you can see on this map here on the right, we have a fair number of sites from across the continent that inform us that humans had indeed, been spread from shore to shore. Now, there are, of course, gaps in regions.
Mm,
Human fossils from the Sahara or West African forests are hard to come by due to the conditions of those places.
right.
But we can at least infer that they were certainly living there too. Um, and some human species we can be definitely confident coexisted with us, Homo naledi, for example, were around. Uh, but others are trickier to figure out. Uh, there are fossils we can safely call early Homo sapiens, but there are lots of others that have so far defied a consensus classification.
Mm,
And we're going to visit some of these mystery humans on the next slide.
yep.
So we're in a similar situation to the previous episode
Mm,
regarding the transitional period between the last African erectines and the first Homo sapiens fossils. There is a huge number of Middle Pleistocene remains from across the continent that cannot be definitively classified, and various authors have given them all sorts of names. Some of these date back 600,000 years, while others, based on new dating techniques, were contemporaneous with the earliest known members of our species. So we're going to meet a couple of these fossils to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. And as always, you can compare these specimens to the chart at the right. Now, starting from the top left, we have the Kabwe 1 skull from the Republic of Zambia. This is the famous Broken Hill skull, named after the mine it was discovered in back in 1921. During that time, the region was under the colonial name of North Rhodesia, and so this specimen was popularly known as the Rhodesian man, which followed from the anthropologist Arthur Smith Woodward, who gave the fossil the scientific name Homo rhodesiensis. Now, given the complicated mess that is Homo heidelbergensis, which we talked about in the last episode,
hmm
this was one of the many Middle Pleistocene human fossils lumped under that name in the past. Now, with the growing understanding that this name should probably be abandoned, if only in part, some researchers have argued that all the African Middle Pleistocene fossils could use the name Homo rhodesiensis
Mm, right.
to distinguish them from the European Homo heidelbergensis. But again, there are still problems with this. It's just shifting one area of focus to another. It's best that we wait for better material and more research before we go around proposing classification schemes,
Hmm.
at least in my opinion. Now, thanks to a 2020 radiometric dating study, Cobway 1 was big in the paleoanthropology news recently. Previously given several potential dates, as old as 500,000 years and as recent as 30,000 years, we can now be confident that Cobway 1 lived between 324 and 274,000 years ago. which makes it a potential neighbor to the earliest known Homo sapiens. So that's very interesting. Next up is the Bodo skull from the Awash River Valley in Ethiopia. This 600,000-year-old skull was uncovered alongside Acheulean tools, as well as animal carcasses with distinct cut marks on the bones. So we actually have evidence of butchering behavior associated with this specimen. Bodo is another one of those species previously lumped into Homo heidelbergensis, along with Cobway 1. In both of these cases, researchers have noted that the skulls do share many similarities with Homo sapiens, including comparable cranial capacity as well as traits typical of earlier erectines, like the prominent brow ridge, which have created much discussion. And as we'll see soon, these have implications for just how our own species evolved in the first place. So then, at the top right, we have the 259,000-year-old Florisbad skull from South Africa. This skull has an interesting research history. It was described in 1935 by anthropologist Thomas F. Dreyer, and it was given a new name, Homo helmei, following a dedication to the sponsor of the fossil dig, R.E. Helmey. Now, Dreyer also coined an alternative genus name, Africanthropus. Now, keep in mind, this was during the time when many hominin fossils were given distinct genera.
Right.
Before we learned that it was much more accurate to include them all as Homo. Now, while the name Africanthropus has since been long gone, you might have seen that the name Homo helmei has lingered on. Well, that's the result of a previously mentioned taxonomic mess, surrounding the Middle Pleistocene human fossils. A 2000 study by McBearty and Brooks gave the suggestion that the Florisbad skull should just remain, distinct and retain the name Homo helmei to distinguish its features from everybody else. But this was not a popular idea. And in fact, there have been a growing trend among many anthropologists, including Chris Stringer and Aurélien Monnier, to emphasize the similarities with later Homo sapiens fossils and actually include this specimen in the same species as us. Well, time will tell if this is appropriate. So moving on to the bottom left, we have the Saldanha, or Elandsfontein skull, which is also from South Africa. This is another older fossil, dates to about 500,000 years, although this is through indirect dating, so this designation may change in the future. It was described in the 1950s, again under a unique name, Homo saldanensis, but later studies sought to include it under Homo heidelbergensis. And you can guess where that discussion went by now. As you can see, it's not a particularly well-preserved fossil. We just have parts of the cranium and the brow ridge. But the remains we do have here are enough to see some close comparisons with Cobway 1, so maybe there is a link there between the two. Next is the Ndutu skull from Tanzania. This one has proved especially tricky to date. We currently have a proposed range from as old as 600,000 years to as young as 400,000 years. It was discovered and described in the 1970s and also associated with stone tools. And the researchers, led by anthropologist R.J. Clark, initially classified it as African Homo erectus, what we'd probably call Homo ergaster nowadays. However, as might be expected, there are quite a few cranial similarities to Homo sapiens as well. And in fact, some authors have gone as far as to propose that they should be classified as such too. And again, these remains have been lumped under Homo heidelbergensis as well. So all kinds of directions you could go. Now, lastly, at the bottom right is the Gwamde skull, or actually skulls, since two have been found. These have been dated to around 180,000 years old, and also more secure dates of 300 to 270,000 years have been proposed. And these have proven difficult to classify in the past. But at least in a similar case to the Florisbad skull, some researchers have recently argued for their inclusion into Homo sapiens. So as you can see, Africa's Middle Pleistocene fossil record has gone through much the same discourse as Eurasia's. It has just proven extremely difficult to figure out where all these fossils go on the human family tree, and whether they have anything to do with Homo sapiens or not. And to add to the confusion, genetic studies have found evidence of interbreeding events between some Homo sapiens populations and presently unknown humans.
Wow.
Yeah, so for convenience, I've indicated two such events here in the timeline. So, Hammer et al. 2011 uncovered an interbreeding event around 35,000 years ago between sapiens forager groups in southern and western Africa and a human population that diverged from our lineage as early as 700,000 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And then Dervasula and Sankararaman 2020 revealed that between 2 and 19% of the DNA in some West African groups hails from an interbreeding event that occurred around 124,000 years ago. Now, the mystery humans that gave this DNA actually seem to have branched off before the sapiens and Neanderthal Denisovan lineages diverged from each other, which
Wow.
would possibly be as early as 1 million years ago.
Jeez.
So, yeah, it seems very clear that the threads of human evolution in Africa, as well as Eurasia, are interwoven very deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Albert, do you have any thoughts?
Um, yeah, I guess it's really interesting to hear about all this in such detail because it's definitely not a subject that is covered in this much depth in most popular sources. And yeah, I guess it seems to me that in part there's the problem of when do you start considering uh, specimens or populations Homo sapiens, and well, what qualifies? I think that seems to me to be part of the issue here. Um, which is of course is always tricky in many contexts, and I guess phylogenetic analyses would help, but because of the admixture going on too, it also doesn't seem to be a very straightforward kind of dichotomous branching pattern either. So I'm sure there's a lot of complexity involved, and I would add that this seems to be the case in a lot of modern lineages of animals that we're trying to take a look at the genetics of, like even just within large mammals, for example. We know within the big cats and the elephants and the bears, there have all been uh, lots and lots of hybridization events in recent, geologically recent history between the different lineages, and so hybridization is normal, it seems, even in large mammals, and certainly very fascinating, but also makes untangling their evolutionary history that much harder.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it does throw kind of a wrench into some of our discussions about species concepts.
Right, right.
I know we talked a little bit about this in the past, and it seems clear at least that it would probably be more responsible to use different species definitions for different groups of organisms,
Right.
just on the nature of like how they breed with each other. I mean, obviously, a species concept for mammals would be widely different from one for like bacteria,
Right.
as a very obvious example. Um, and I know some individuals and researchers in paleoanthropology have kind of looked at all of this interbreeding and uncertainty and have kind of thrown their hands in the air and say, well, how about this? If we know that like, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and Denisovans and all these guys interbred with each other, then why don't we just make it easy and say that the whole thing is Homo
Mm,
sapiens and call it a day? Um, Now that is a fair point. However, I do know that there has been a response from like researchers in the field that have kind of looked down on
mm,
this idea because it's a question of the amount of admixture
right.
and how much of it really goes deep into the actual origin of lineages. We know that the Neanderthal Denisovan line and the Homo sapiens line diverge from each other prior to a lot of this interbreeding that's been uncovered from genetic studies. And it seems that the vast majority of ancestry in Homo sapiens groups probably mostly comes from Homo sapiens groups,
Mm, mm,
with instances of interbreeding here and there with Neanderthals, but not at a level as to be significant.
right.
We don't see cases where living human populations have 50% of their genes with a Neanderthal, for example. It's always smaller and smaller amounts.
Mm, mm,
So that has prompted a lot of these researchers to say that it would still be reasonable to consider the Neanderthals, Denisovans, or at least the Neanderthal-Denisman line and the Homo sapiens line, as distinct species,
Mm-hmm.
while also recognizing that this interbreeding plays a role in our development over time. So I guess it just kind of goes to like it's a huge discourse.
You're right.
And you do bring up a very good point, Albert. As you might have been able to gather, it seems that a big problem in this lies in finding traits to distinguish Homo sapiens from the other human
Mm-hmm.
species.
Right, right.
Linnaeus famously decreed, "Know thyself," when he coined our scientific name. But is that actually easier said than done?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we go to the next slide, we'll see. Hey, 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 who are those two beautiful people over there?
Good question.
Yeah, I wonder. Uh, so, it turns out that a number of features in our skeleton, and mostly in our skull, have been used to identify and classify fossil remains as Homo sapiens. But these are not as clear cut as you might think. Humans today are very diverse in morphology, even if our actual genetic differences are almost non existent. The sapiens, typically, has a round occipital region. That is to say, the back of our skull is smoothly curved. This is in comparison with other derived Homo, where their skulls usually have an occipital bun that protrudes backwards. But if you remember from the last episode, a few people alive today also have occipital buns.
Mm.
Seriously, like, pause the video right now and go to Wikipedia and type in occipital bun, and there's a photo of a dude where the back of his head pokes out of it.
Mm.
So you can see this. It's cool. And that's not to forget that many fossils of Homo sapiens going back many tens of thousands of years also sported them too. Like, we know they're Homo sapiens, but there's an occipital bun. So it seems that the transition from often having an occipital bun to mostly having a smooth occipital region was very gradual. Now, sapiens also has a globular cranial vault, so the part of our skull that holds the brain is very spherical. Other derived humans have famously flatter skull caps, and indeed some of the earliest Homo sapiens fossils share these traits too. In fact, some of those had been previously classified as Neanderthals before more recent research. Now, in having a globular skull cap, that means that our forehead is also large,
Mm.
and our brow ridges are almost non existent. But again, not all living humans lack a brow ridge. So there's still a bit of variation on this part.
Mm-hmm.
And what's probably more important than having a high forehead, and I'm grateful to Dr. Holtz for pointing this out, is that our face as a whole has actually sunk.
Mm.
So, like, if you look at Neanderthal or erectine skulls, for example, you can see that their faces are high up on their skull to the point where the forehead is noticeably small. On living Homo sapiens faces, and this is pretty much always the case, our face is low on the skull.
Right.
And that's a very helpful feature for identification. Not to mention that it's fairly flat, too. The sort of prognathism that you see in Neanderthals and earlier species is not as pronounced, if it's present at all. Now, here's one that you might not think about much. Homo sapiens is the only hominin to have an actual honest to goodness, bony protruding chin.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at other human skulls, like those of Neanderthals, that part of the jaw is not as prominent. And if you were looking at a shaved Neanderthal, the lack of a chin would be immediately noticeable. Now, teeth, as it turns out, are really good indicators for telling if a hominin fossil you found is sapiens or not. Out of all the human species, our teeth have a particularly high enamel height and a short pulp compared to the others. Not to forget that the overall size of our teeth is much smaller than in other hominins. Now, of course, it must be pointed out that even in early Homo sapiens fossils, the teeth show a slightly larger size overall, and then as time goes on, they get gradually smaller. Now, there are at least two major postcranial features that are helpful in identifying sapiens fossils. Number one, our pelvis, which is narrower and much less flared than another human species. So, like, if you look at a modern human pelvis and you look at, say, the pelvis of Homo erectus, you'll notice that the wings of the ilium in the latter are very pointed, and
Mm.
outward flaring, versus in a sapiens pelvis, where the wings are much smoother at the ends. And then the second feature concerns the rib cage, in which our species has a rather cylindrical rib cage in profile, while other human species tended to have a sort of conical rib cage, where the ribs gradually splay out further down the body. Now, in essence, all of these features, while not perfect, are very helpful in identifying when you have a member of Homo sapiens versus another known human like a Neanderthal. Uh, our skeleton in general is a lot more gracile than in our closest relatives, which I previously described as robust in form.
Mm.
It turns out that it's because of this distinct anatomy that there's such a mess in classification regarding the African Middle Pleistocene.
Mm.
We found a lot of remains of humans that don't look completely like earlier erectines, and they don't look completely like living Homo sapiens. But some of them will have notable sapiens features in
Mm.
certain aspects.
Right.
Some might have the globular skulls while they have the prominent brow ridges, and some might have the low flat skulls, but then their teeth are very sapiens like, and they have a flattened low face. So, what does all of this mean? Well, we go to the next slide here. It was conventionally thought that the origin of Homo sapiens was a very straightforward process. Our species evolved in a single region of the African continent, possibly in the east, because that was where the earliest fossils were found,
Mm.
and then subsequently expanded its population and replaced all the older human species, possibly through ecological competition. This is generally known as the in Africa replacement model. Now, those earliest sapiens fossils were the roughly 195,000-year-old Omo Kibish specimens from the namesake Omo National Park in Ethiopia, which were unearthed by Richard Leakey and colleagues in the late 60s, early 70s. They matched up very well with the early genetic studies, which were arguing for an origin date of 200,000 years for our species. Younger fossils of Homo sapiens had been uncovered by Mary Leakey at roughly the same time as the Omo remains, these being the fairly complete LH18 skull from Tanzania, which is dated to about 120,000 years old. And as much as we could see, these fossils matched up very well with the known skeletal variation of living Homo sapiens. And it generally hypothesized that the first members of our species contained the full suite of features that, an average characterized us. So that is to say, they were anatomically modern humans, which
Mm.
properly distinguished us from all the other hominids. Well, as more archaeological evidence was unearthed, things began to get complicated. In the late 90s, anthropologist Tim White and colleagues described a collection of fossils called BOUVP16, more popularly known as the Hirto specimens. These remains, including a near complete skull, which I've shown below, were only around 160,000 years old, and they definitely belonged to Homo sapiens, but there was just something off about them. The skull was quite robust and much larger and longer than what is known for living humans, and the brow ridge was just prominent enough to be noticeable.
Mm.
According to the 2003 paper by Tim White's team, they claimed that these remains were, and I quote here, morphologically just beyond the range of variation seen in anatomically modern Homo sapiens. And so they felt justified to classify the remains as a subspecies, Homo sapiens idaltu,
Mm.
which comes from the Afar word for elder. Now, this was quite controversial. Previous researchers had tried to make the Neanderthals a subspecies of sapiens, sure, but to suggest yet another from such a small sample size, almost immediately several anthropologists called it into question.
Mm.
And usually nowadays, the name Homo sapiens idaltu isn't really used that much. But still, the ancestral features on an otherwise typical sapien skull was very curious, but still not enough to radically shake the conventional in Africa replacement model. But then came Jebel Irhoud 1 from Morocco, which I have here on the photo above. Now, this specimen had been already known for several decades. It was typically classified as a North African Neanderthal,
Mm.
based on these similar skull characters. Had a long, relatively low cranium, thick brow ridges, and so forth. So it seemed that Neanderthals were living in the Atlas regions of Africa around 160,000 years ago, making Mousterian-like tools. However, much of this interpretation was dramatically changed. For one, further research on the Jebel Irhoud 1 skull, as well as newer remains from the site, indicated that the fossils did not represent Neanderthals as once thought, but were instead members of Homo sapiens.
Hmm.
One of the clues lied in a closer examination of the teeth. Again, they were bigger than living humans, but the dimensions of the enamel and pulp were a dead giveaway. And of course, save for the brow ridge, much of the facial anatomy was more in line with sapiens than with Neanderthals. But so what? Another uniquely built member of our species living in Morocco, big deal, right?
Mhm.
It still matches with what we understand about our origins in East Africa. Hang on a sec, because secondly, the site where the fossils were unearthed was redated with newer techniques back in 2017. And when the results came back, oh my goodness, the anthropological community was in for a shock. The Jebel Irhoud remains were roughly 315 and 286,000 years old. This was significantly older than the Omo Kibish remains.
Mhm.
I mentioned that they were practically on the other side of the continent. So, how could this fit with the in Africa replacement model? Well, the best way to explain this new evidence as parsimoniously as possible, as well as to reconcile this whole collection of Middle Pleistocene humans with varying levels of sapiens features, was to produce a new model. And this is Pan African multi regionalism. In essence, Homo sapiens evolved from several interbreeding populations of humans throughout the African continent. Each of these different groups would have sported some of the features typically seen in living humans, like lower flattened faces or round occipital regions. And over time, as these populations mixed, more and more of those features would become the norm, while more ancestral traits were lost. And eventually, and very gradually, the typical form of Homo sapiens emerged across Africa
Hmm.
to produce fossils as clearly like us as Homo kabish or LH18. Well, this proved to be a popular model for a long time, and it fit well with the more recent understandings of how extensive interbreeding was between Homo sapiens and other species like Neanderthals.
Hmm.
Human evolution, it seems, was less a linear progression nor a neat phylogenetic tree, but rather a tangled web, with species and forms mixing and matching constantly. However, as recently as this year, some anthropologists have even called this into question. Not so much that it's inaccurate, but that it's difficult to test scientifically.
Hmm.
We just don't have enough archaeological or genetic remains from across the Pleistocene epoch to really see whether Pan African multi regionalism actually occurred the way the model suggests. And so, in the end, there really is no consensus as to how Homo sapiens evolved, much less where we evolved. All we can be certain of is the observations that the oldest remains of our species come from Africa, and that the suite of skeletal traits that is often used to distinguish us from other human species did not emerge all at once.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the idea behind the anatomically modern human has more or less been discredited.
Hmm.
And similarly, the same goes for the idea of behavioral modernity, which I had mentioned earlier. This was popularized by a physiologist and ornithologist who you might know, Jared Diamond,
Hmm. Yeah.
who in the late 80s infamously wrote about the Great Leap Forward,
Hmm.
human evolution, that is, which is when our species supposedly acquired the current suite of creative traits around 35,000 years
You're
ago.
right.
Well, this has proven very easy to debunk, as this idea was based on the then current evidence in archaeology of the oldest known aesthetic and cultural items in the human record. Of course, as you've already seen countless times in this series, evidence of this sort has been now found going back many tens of thousands of years, further back in time in non Homo sapiens humans. And what we think of as behaviorally modern features in our species almost certainly emerged as gradually as our average skeletal anatomy did.
Hmm.
So those two ideas have more or less been put to bed. Before we move forward, Albert, do you have anything to add?
Uh, Nothing except to just say that I guess this kind of ambiguity is kind of what we would likely expect from evolution, I guess. Um, yeah, it's of course frustrating to researchers, but I think if we have such a pretty such a complete record, relatively speaking, showing all these fine scale kind of variations, it is not surprising that there would be such an ambiguous situation that we can't really be sure, like it can't really piece together exactly when all of our so-called unique features were assembled, because that's just how evolution works.
Right. A lot of this discussion really stemmed for me from a really great article from John Hawkes, who's an anthropologist,
Mm-hmm.
and it has like a very clever title: "No Anatomically Modern Elephants."
Mm.
Like the whole idea of like an anatomically modern X, platypus, a
Mm.
rhino, a finch. You don't see that kind of talk
Right.
among researchers of those species, and yet in human origins research, it was all over the place.
Right. Right.
And so yeah, it kind of goes back to what you were talking about. Um, it's probably not good practice to even think in those terms.
Mm.
As if all this evolution is happening just to create, this characteristic form alive today.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's jump to the next slide here, and we're going to move a little bit further in time, uh, which then begs the question: well, how did the earliest Homo sapiens diversify
Mm-hmm.
on the African continent? Anthropologists have long understood that the peoples of Africa constituted a great diversity of peoples, and while many of them attempted to lump all of this variety into one or several races, modern genetics have proven them very wrong. For one thing, we now understand that Africa today contains the most genetic diversity out of the entire living population of Homo sapiens.
Mm-hmm.
All humans who have immediate ancestors outside Africa make up just a small portion of this total genetic makeup, which is a story we'll explore in the next episode, of course. Uh, that being said, even with all this genetic diversity, every genetic study on living humans ever performed has consistently shown that everyone alive today shares a common ancestor that was itself a member of Homo sapiens. And these same studies have managed to reveal that there were a number of deeply diverging lineages that emerged shortly after our species evolved, in much the same way that we understand that the Neanderthals and Denisovans had regional variants. However, it must be stressed again, based on the genetic evidence, that these lineages would have often admixed with each other
Mm-hmm.
as they gained unique genes to suit their environments. This has complicated our understanding of subsequent Homo sapiens evolution, and while we can make out some important details, there is currently no consensus on just how the modern human population structure arose and diversified. The chart on the right here should emphasize this point. At least five lineages of present day sapiens ancestry have been distinguished through genetic studies, and all of them go back to a period between 350 and 104,000 years ago. So, of course, we have non Africans, which it seems constitute a single lineage. This was the major one which departed Africa and peopled the world. We have East Africans, of course, which today included the ancestry of many pastoralist groups in the region, including the Cushitic speaking Agao of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the Nilotic speaking Dinka of South Sudan. We have West Africans, some of the descendants of whom have gained a real foothold in the sub Saharan region as the speakers of the Bantu family of languages. We have the Central African foragers, which once had a wide range across the equatorial forests, but have since been reduced in number thanks to the previously mentioned Bantu expansion.
Mm-hmm.
A little more about that later. And last, we have the Khoisan speaking foragers, which today make up much of the ancestry of the living Khoi Khoi and Bushmen in southern Africa. But they had a much larger range in the past. Genetic studies have shown that those in southern Africa and those more to the north, near present day Tanzania and Malawi, mostly diverged from each other fairly early on. Now, present day Africans and non Africans retain ancestry from many of these major lineages. which again often admixed in the past and present. So the web of human evolution, even within our species, runs very far and very wide. Now, of note here, which you might notice, is a so called ghost lineage of Homo sapiens,
Hmm.
which was discovered last year in a 2020 study by Mark Lipson and colleagues. This lineage has very deep roots that it had admixed with some West African groups sometime before 8,000 years ago, and they seem to have made up a significant part of the population of West Africa before most of the ancestors of present day peoples in the region lived there.
Hmm.
Now, this is all still very, recent research, and other anthropologists would like to see more data unearthed before, further discussion on this point can be made.
Hmm.
But still, it's a very fascinating discovery. Now, before moving on, I should mention and clarify who mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam were.
Hmm.
You might have read in popular literature that all humans alive today can trace their maternal and paternal lines to just two individuals who lived in Africa. Now, this is true to a point. However, there has been a large amount of misunderstanding
Hmm.
regarding this discovery. And many people, and this includes publishing anthropologists and historians, have made mistakes when explaining this. For starters, the dates when these individuals lived have risen and fallen with many genetic studies over the years. But the most recent work has managed to cement the age of mitochondrial Eve between 148 and 99,000 years ago, and Y chromosomal Adam between 188 and 134,000 years
Hmm.
ago. So already they post date the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils,
Hmm. Hmm.
as well as many of the genetic studies which demonstrate the emergence of our species by 350,000 years ago. In no way were these two individuals the very first Homo sapiens ever.
Hmm.
That's you know, and given the estimated times when these humans lived, it's a bit unlikely that they would have met each other.
Right.
Not impossible, but very improbable. So don't go thinking that this is simply a case of moving the story of Adam and Eve to Africa.
Right.
Those were just the characters that inspired the names.
Hmm.
That otherwise has nothing to do with this topic. Um, that means obviously that mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam were not the first biological female and male Homo sapiens to have ever lived.
Hmm.
There would absolutely have been other members of the sexes around when they lived. The question then arises, well, how can just one female and one male out of many give rise to all the other people on the earth today? What about all the others that were living alongside them? Well, it's simply a matter of population genetics. To take mitochondrial Eve's example, she managed to successfully have daughters who were able to mate and have daughters of their own. And over the generations, the members of other sapiens mating pairs would have managed to have daughters too, but eventually their maternal lines would have died out if
Hmm.
only sons were born. So, thus, mitochondrial Eve's maternal line managed to survive across tens of thousands of years, forming all the various mitochondrial haplogroups that geneticists have used to understand our spread around the world. And the same process holds true for Y chromosomal Adam, in which that paternal line lived on while all the others eventually petered out. Now, I should clarify that the nature of human admixing means that the story of common ancestry is a little bit funny.
Hmm.
While the recognition of maternal and paternal common ancestors is important, when you visit more recent periods of history, you can find more recent parents of us all. Thinking mathematically, you can trace your own family history. You have two parents, each of one has two parents, so that makes four grandparents. Each of them had two parents, so that's eight great grandparents. Each of them had two parents, so that's 16 great great grandparents. You can see where this is going. Eventually, you'd get to a point where the total number of your ancestors surpasses the current human population today,
Hmm.
which is not in line with what we know of historical population growth. At increasingly older levels, you're going to share ancestors with other people that aren't usually listed in your family albums.
Right.
That means that everyone on Earth today shares the same set of ancestors. what is known as the genetic isopoint. There was a famous 2004 study by a statistician, Douglas Rudd, who calculated that the most recent isopoint for all of humanity could be traced back to a pair of individuals who walked the earth between the years 1415 BC and 55 AD. So just think about some of the historical figures around during those times. We might all have had ancestors who lived in the imperial court of the Han dynasty, or maybe they fought during the Peloponnesian War, or maybe they helped compose the Tanakh. And it doesn't matter if you live in Ohio or Osaka, that pair would have been one of your ancestors. Uh, what do you think about that?
It's quite profound, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so common ancestry is a fascinating thing.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. All right, let's jump to the next slide now. Um, in thinking about the Middle Pleistocene transition to Homo sapiens and how you had such a change in morphology from the longer skulled, robust bodies of Homo sapiens' direct ancestors to the globular skulled, gracile bodies of living humans today, the question begs just why that change occurred at all. What were the selection pressures that acted on African humans to bring about such a radical change in anatomical proportions? There have been a couple of ideas to explain this, but the one which has gained a lot of popularity in recent years is the self domestication hypothesis, in which our suite of modern anatomical features is the result of unconscious artificial selection acting on human communities by those very same communities. Now, despite the recent discussions here, this is not a new idea. As far back as 1868, Charles Darwin wrote about it in his book, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the logic behind this hypothesis stems from our research on our own domestic pets and livestock. Over thousands of years, as various mammalian species were tamed and bred in captivity, their outward appearances began to change. Features emerged that their human owners were not consciously selecting for. Pig owners just wanted the animals to have good flesh to eat and
Right.
easy to access to get that meat. But the next thing they knew, the descendants of these tamed wild boars were sporting floppy ears and curly tails. Their snouts were shorter. They had smaller teeth. Their brains were smaller. And they were depigmenting in places too, gaining little brown and white spots on their skin. And much the same thing was happening to goats and cattle and sheep. Livestock were beginning to express more docile and even juvenile behaviors. They were acting more like babies than the wild animals they started as. And this process was really exemplified by the very first animals we ever domesticated, the wolf.
Mm-hmm.
If you compare the features of your typical wild wolf and a domestic dog, this process of change basically turned an aggressive, robust animal into a giant puppy. And we have to consider the more likely scenario that led us to owning dogs in the first place, in which wolves began coexisting with humans for the benefits of feeding on the leftovers of their kills, as well as general protection.
Mm-hmm.
It has been observed that wolves do not handle the same sort of captive treatment that is given to other livestock. Um, Rearing wolves with a constant supply of food, keeping them fenced in, is difficult, and it's hard to see that as the path to domestication.
Mm-hmm.
It has been strongly argued then that means they domesticated themselves. They got less aggressive and more trusting and friendly, and the next thing you know, the wolves' bodies changed. Their faces and legs got shorter, their ears shrunk and flopped, their brains and teeth got smaller, and they started sporting patches of white and brown in their fur. And these were all the things that their human owners were likely not choosing initially. Now, one of the biggest lines of evidence for the self-domestication hypothesis stemmed from the famous silver fox experiments by Nikolai Belyaev and Ludmila Trut during the Soviet-era Russia. Starting with a sample of average red foxes, divided into two groups, the team would then very casually interact with the experimental group, just kind of making their presence known and trying to pet the foxes. Any foxes that showed the slightest bit of trust were bred together, and the control group was simply bred indiscriminately, regardless of trust. And over time, as more and more of the trusting foxes were bred, their outward appearances changed to reflect the aforementioned suite of traits seen in domestic livestock. So these foxes were not only friendly and playful as puppies, but their coats changed. They started sprouting spots. Their tails curled. Their ears turned floppy. Their muzzles shortened, and their teeth and skulls shrunk. And the only thing that was being selected for was friendliness and trust.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't trying to breed foxes with spots or foxes with curly tails. It just happened.
Mm-hmm.
And decades later, the friendly foxes, which are still being studied, have changed dramatically from their earliest forms. And that control group has barely changed at all. So in this scenario, it's important to note that Belyaev and Trut were not testing self-domestication per se, but the effects of domestication for tameness on phenotype. But still, this experiment is relevant. Now, the keys here to the self-domestication hypothesis in animals like wolves and silver foxes lay in the process being mostly unconscious. Obviously, a wild wolf would do well not to attack any of the humans that are providing the scraps it needs to eat, much more the space needed to keep on enjoying such a supply of food that is effortless to acquire. And obviously, a human would probably prefer that a wild wolf not be a threat to their family. Working together in a communal setting requires cooperation and kindness. The more wolves that acted a bit more trusting and gentle around people, and the more humans that preferred friendlier wolves around their kin, then greater the chances of starting a positive feedback loop that turned wolf into dog, all without people deliberately keeping wolves in captivity and selecting them for kindness by themselves. And what followed was a suite of physical changes that made the domesticated wolves look very different from their ancestors, as explained by the silver fox experiments. So, what does all of this mean for the evolution of Homo sapiens? Well, quite simply, the same phenomena that turned wolves into dogs might have turned early humans into the derived modern form of Homo sapiens. And one of the biggest proponents of this self-domestication hypothesis in humans is by anthropologist Brian Hare, who published a very fascinating book last year called Survival of the Friendliest, which I do recommend. In essence, and I'm quoting here, the human self-domestication hypothesis posits that natural selection acted on our species in favor of friendlier behavior that enhanced our ability to flexibly cooperate and communicate. Over generations, individuals with hormonal and developmental profiles that favor friendliness and thus cooperative communication were more successful. So basically, in the societies that the ancestors of Homo sapiens lived in, the general rules of the social contract meant that it was better for humans to work together and establish good relations within their communities in order to survive and flourish, because then everybody benefits. If the discussion around Pan-African multi-regionalism holds firm, well, then populations of humans had gradually begun to expand their social networks and interact with larger and larger communities than ever before, to the point of admixing with each other. And the best way to ensure that conflict doesn't arise is to establish good relations and kindness with this growing neighborhood. And this can be facilitated through rules and moral codes, through education and example. For example, but note that this is not the same as direct artificial selection. No one would have thought to do all of this in the name of making better humans. That's not what would have happened here.
Right.
Self-domestication is not the same thing as eugenics. That is bogus and harmful pseudoscience.
Yeah.
Thrown in the garbage. But anyway, over time, and here I'm harkening back to the silver fox experiments, there would have been physical changes to the overall human anatomy that made our ancestors much less robust and more gracile, and changed our heads towards the globular skull, reduced brow ridge, smaller brains and teeth that we find typically for our species today. Now, one proposed anatomical change that we can't find in the fossil record concerns our sclera, that is, the whites of our eyes. Out of all the primates on Earth today, every lemur, tarsier, monkey, and non-hominin ape, only we have this feature. Our sclera are white because they don't have pigment. And this created a great billboard for our irises, which also displays a greater variety of colors than in other primates. thing with domesticated mammals too. Typically, they have more eye colors than their wild relatives. So if this is a result of self-domestication, then the implications for how we understand other human species and their behaviors is fairly large.
Mm-hmm.
That would mean that only the later members of Homo sapiens, the ones which began to really accumulate those typical modern features, had whites in their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So Neanderthals and their kin, erectines, havelines, Australopithecines, they all might have shared the dark pigmented sclera that other primates have. And that's just really strange to think about. We're so used to reconstructions of other hominins with the whites in their eyes, but
Right.
maybe that's wrong.
Yeah.
Um, Humans today are also the only primates that use their eyes to help others gauge direction.
Mm.
So, if you're sitting across from me right now and you kind of shift your eyes to the side, I will see that as a signal to look in the direction your irises are
Mm.
pointing.
Right. Right.
Other primates can't do that. In study after study, researchers have shown that monkeys and apes have to actually turn their whole heads in order for others to follow the direction they're pointing at, or they have to extend their arms out, for example. Uh, it's only with the evolution of depigmented sclera, the self-domestication hypothesis posits, that humans could begin to read subtle cues in the eyes.
Mm.
And well, this would have played a big role in the recognition of needs and wants, which would have further facilitated communication and cooperation. It's all psychological. So, by extension, earlier or related species of humans, like Neanderthals, might not have shared these same sorts of delicate communication by eye contact that Homo sapiens has, which would then change how we understand their societies and cultures. Now, much of this is still very speculative.
Mm-hmm.
While there have been a number of human fossil surveys that demonstrate some of these anatomical changes that are argued by the self domestication hypothesis, not everyone is convinced.
Right.
For example, there was a study from last year by Dor Shilton and colleagues that actually challenged Brian Hare's self domestication model by arguing that the change in phenotype and behavior among humans is more reminiscent of social mammals rather than domestic mammals. So it is more a question of emotional control and plasticity in greater social contexts than a preference for more friendliness and less aggression within communities that explains the evolution of our features. There's a lot more I could say,
Mm-hmm.
but for now we do have to move on. The most important thing that I'd like you all to know is that there is a vast body of research that has been underway for decades that is attempting to understand why Homo sapiens evolved the way it did,
Mm-hmm.
why our bodies are so different compared to our extinct relatives. We're just not there yet to say anything definitive. Albert, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Oh, definitely. I think it's a fascinating hypothesis, and you I think even if it needs some tweaking, I do think it is somewhat plausible that a lot of our features could be explained through this kind of process, and that's definitely a very interesting thought that a lot of STEM humans probably did not have eyes like we do, and that definitely is something that would be interesting to see more of in kind of paleoartistic restorations. Um, there is there are interesting parallels in birds actually regarding using eyes as signals. So I know there was a study that was done like a number of years ago on jackdaws, which have like white irises,
Hmm.
very very strikingly compared to other corvids, which are they're related to crows and ravens and such. And apparently they also use their kind of strongly contrasting eyes as kind of social signals in their communication with their own species. Now, in birds, the eyes are a lot less mobile than in ours, so imagine the very very subtle kind of eye movements are not all there. But even so, we do see precedent in other types of animals regarding selection for a similar feature.
Oh, that's interesting. I think I know what kinds of. You said jackdaws?
Yeah,
Yeah.
jackdaws.
Yeah, I think I've seen that before. It's very I don't know, it's kind of one of those things that I know people have talked about being is a little bit uncanny.
Right, right.
Like when other animals have eyes like we do.
You're right. Yeah.
I remember I think Darren Naish on the Tetsu podcast, he had talked about like on the Planet of the Apes trilogy, the recent one,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
where Caesar, being a chimp, but like a super smart chimp, and he has the whites in his eyes. It was like
Right.
it was a little bit off for him to see that, um,
Right. Hmm.
which I guess is supposed to kind of play into this idea of like greater mobility and communication and cooperation, which would have led to the ape uprising and everything.
Yeah, true, true. But yeah, that's true. Now that you bring it up, they did do that in that series.
Yeah, I really should watch those movies again. I like them quite a bit.
Yeah, they're
But
pretty
that,
good.
yeah, a tangent. Um, Alrighty, so let's go to the next slide here.
Sure thing.
So the subject of the self-domestication hypothesis makes a really great segue from the world of biological anthropology into the world of cultural anthropology. The two, after all, work together in a complex framework to make us who we are.
Hmm.
We got a little bit of biology, a little bit of the culture, a little bit more, and boom, human beings. Um, and we can use studies of culture as well as related fields like psychology and sociology to try to understand what kinds of lives the earliest Homo sapiens might have lived. I have talked a lot about ethnographies in previous episodes, which you may remember are written anthropological accounts of human societies, which try to be complete in their coverage of all aspects of life,
Hmm.
from kinship and marriage to diet and technology. Now, these have often been used in cross cultural studies that try to say something about how humans might have behaved in prehistory, but they are far from perfect. Just to quote archaeologist Stephen Mithen briefly, there are no shortcuts to the prehistoric past.
Hmm.
It's not wise to pull directly from, in our case, ethnographies of hunter-gatherer societies and argue that oh, they can tell us how humans lived 100,000 years
Hmm.
ago or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
You know, because these societies, for all their cultural adaptations towards a foraging lifestyle, have undergone as much change as those of agricultural
Hmm.
communities.
Right.
Well, we're not living in the same world as our ancestors. If we really want to understand early Homo sapiens, then we have to always be sure to check the evidence in the archaeological record.
Hmm.
But still, to be fair, the cross cultural approach, when used responsibly and when checked for context with archaeology,
Hmm.
can provide some idea of potential behavior.
Yeah.
For anthropologists, have been able to find some underlying universals among particular types of societal units. So I may be forgiven for digging a little bit into this approach today. Now, first of all, I must specify that when I use the word forager, I mean the same thing as hunter gatherer.
Hmm.
I prefer to use the former term only because it helps kind of remove emphasis. Forager societies typically do more gathering than hunting anyway.
Hmm.
So when you say like hunter gatherer, that kind of implies that hunting is the primary focus
Right.
when it's
Right.
not. But anywho, what might early Homo sapiens communities have been like? Well, the general understanding, based on the archaeological record, is that the first sapiens lived in nomadic forager bands. These are relatively fluid communities, further divided into subgroups called local bands, and the fluidity stems from the fact that the bands themselves engaged in fission fusion relationships. The overall group size, configuration of members, and physical residence changed often as individuals moved from group to group or as conditions changed. This is what the archaeological and ethnographic record has been telling us. But it must be remembered that the African record is very patchy
Hmm.
throughout the Middle Stone Age. Vast swaths of time are missing from our radar, and it's just as likely that nomadic forager bands were not the only lifeways humans engaged in. There was a really fascinating article from last month by anthropologist Manveer Singh that made the argument that sedentary forager societies might have existed very early in the record of African Homo sapiens.
Hmm.
We're going to talk a little bit more about these types of societies in a future episode, but in brief, when environmental conditions ensure a very abundant supply of natural resources, forager groups had the ability to settle down permanently in one place and use what the land offered. The archaeological evidence is strong that these types of societies eventually produced agriculture. But again, if the conditions are right, people could settle down and easily feed themselves without developing farming. And these same conditions could lead to social stratification. Singh points to discussions by fellow anthropologists like Polly Wessener, who have worked with living nomadic forager societies like the Kalahari Bushmen and have learned that prior to the introduction of agriculture by the Bantu speaking peoples, they lived in a very different society than the nomadic one that has been recorded by ethnologists for decades, more socially stratified than what is seen today. This is interesting to speculate on, but Singh admits that the evidence is just not there in the archaeological record to really say that sedentary societies existed in Africa so early on.
Mm.
Usually because no one has really bothered to look. So for the time being, it is best to think of Homo sapiens societies in the Middle Pleistocene as typically of the nomadic forager band type.
Mm.
Now, the keys to a good life within a nomadic band is cooperation. Cooperation is necessary for getting food, keeping intergroup relations in check, and transmitting knowledge across future generations through education. With cooperation comes reciprocity, and as far as resources goes, nomadic forager bands tended to be egalitarian. So take food acquirement, for example. As I've stated previously, most of the calories used by a forager community come more from gathered foods than hunted ones. On average, something like 20% of that came from the meat of big game kills. The rest is all plants and small animals foraged
Mm.
in the local area. Um, and it's not like hunts were always common or even successful either.
Mm.
A good hunter would be lucky to kill a substantial animal twice in 1 week. So it was the gathering of plants and small animals that usually fed the community. And as a quick side note, cross-cultural analyses of recent nomadic forager groups often revealed that hunting and gathering were gendered activities.
Mm.
So women working in groups were usually the ones gathering, while the men would go out and hunt, either on their own or in a small group. Thus, it was assumed that this was the way things were for our distant ancestors. Recent studies digging into the anthropological record, however, have quickly been throwing this interpretation out the window.
Mm.
Many sites around the world have shown that hunting was not necessarily a gendered activity, and that women as well as men participated in the practice. So, whatever the modern constructs in recent forager societies may be, they most likely do not reflect what we see in the distant past.
Mm.
Which goes to show again how tricky the cross-cultural approach can be
Right.
when it's not checked against the archaeological record. Now, when meals were collected through hunting or gathering, they were almost always evenly shared among the community. A hunter bringing back an antelope or a zebra, he does not get to claim all the spoils for himself. A third party usually comes in and divides the kill into even parts, which are then given to the people. And here's where the cooperative spirit really comes in, because in nearly all the cases seen in recent forager societies, whenever somebody would take a piece of meat from a kill, they'd make sure to pass it around to another member until everybody had something to eat.
Mm.
And a big understanding behind this, given the cooperative social contract, was that someone who was given food by a distributor would eventually act as a distributor after the next successful hunt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another quick note. You might have read in the popular literature that the process of hunting and gathering was so relatively easy that the average work week for a forager was on the order of 15 to 20 hours total, which would have left the rest of that time for other activities, including leisure. Yeah, well, those results come from ethnographic studies during the 60s and 70s, and the anthropologists who were behind them used a particular definition of work,
Mm.
what we might consider today. For them, work was defined as the act of collecting food. But what they didn't consider was the act of food preparation.
Mm.
Because it's one thing to, pluck some nuts from a tree or
Right.
catch a fish, but you still have to make it suitable to eat.
You're right.
And it turns out that when you factor in food preparation, then the forager work week grows to an average of 70 hours, which is a lot,
Yeah.
especially when you compare that to typical work weeks today. I read that the average American spends anywhere from 34 to 46 hours a week doing
Mm.
work. And even then, that's exhausting as hell.
Right.
So, keep that in mind. Moving on, we now have to consider the presence of intra-group strangers, which presents something different in the story of human evolution. These are recognized by individuals as belonging to their own groups or identities, while not necessarily living with them in their immediate communities.
Mm.
You see this all the time in the present day.
Mm-hmm.
You might go on to the park for a birding trip. You got your favorite football team logo on your T-shirt, and the next thing you know, you bump into another birder who's got the same logo on their shirt. You recognize that this person is a fellow fan, as well as
Mm-hmm.
somebody who shares your hobby, and then it becomes a little bit easier to identify with them,
Right.
trust them, and form a connection. And that's the key. There is almost always greater empathy and trust extended to these intra-group strangers, especially in the context of a nomadic forager band,
Mm-hmm.
where people can often leave their local subgroups and enter different ones. This recognition of shared identity was probably a major factor in maintaining cooperative social relations. Cross cultural studies have shown that foragers tended to leave their local bands for others with people who were more like them on personal levels,
Mm-hmm.
rather than stay with those they didn't bond with very well. And research from psychology shows that greater empathy between like minded individuals releases oxytocin levels in the brain,
Mm-hmm.
which is a neurohormone that has been linked to behavioral changes that help people lose fear and distrust. And it's also linked to the bond that forms between a mother and a baby. So you can see how strong this is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so this is a very flexible system that can be seen in human communities. Children growing up within their local bands not only learn to recognize family members or close friends, but also strangers from other bands who share their ideals. Now, when taken to the next level, this becomes a critical factor in the emergence of social norms and roles,
Mm-hmm.
trade networks between regional bands, as well as participation in multi group hunts to take down bigger and bigger prey animals or larger groups of prey animals. But there's also a dark side to this
Mm-hmm.
that you might guess, and that's the emergence of xenophobia.
Yeah.
That bond with intergroup strangers can be so strong that when an intergroup stranger appears, all that empathy and trust can easily slip away. That person becomes strange and different. They don't look like me. You don't use the same symbols that I do. And that means that they probably don't think like me either. It's a sad phenomena
Mm-hmm.
that's been documented across various psychological and sociological studies. I mean, even babies and young children tend to prefer intergroup strangers to outsiders,
Mm-hmm.
and all it takes is a perceived threat, not necessarily real, to stir up trouble. And that brings us to the subject of warfare. I've been alluding to this discussion previously on our show. When did warfare emerge?
Mm-hmm.
How can we tell when an archaeological site shows the aftermath of a war? How do you define war in the first place? That last question has proved very difficult because different anthropologists have relied on different definitions. On the one hand, you have researchers like Richard Wrangham, who define war as conflict with intent to harm between multiple members of intergroups as, to quote Wrangham, independent political units. On the other hand, you have researchers like Douglas Fry, who recognize this definition but prefer not to think of kin groups as independent polities, which Wrangham does. So, when both camps' researchers examined the same ethnographic evidence from nomadic forager societies in recent years, they came to different conclusions because of this. Wrangham sees warfare as almost endemic among forager societies, while Fry sees high levels of homicides and family feuds, but warfare tends to be non existent. So, who is right? It's hard to say. When you look at the evidence for warfare and violence itself, or when you look at the evidence for violence itself among nomadic foragers, you do find some key themes. The most common killings are homicides due to conflicts about women, so like kidnappings by men, or maybe two dudes arguing over the same girl.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also accusations of adultery or witchcraft on the part of the woman, who ends up being the one killed. There's also killings due to reports of unwanted behavior, so cheaters.
Mm-hmm.
Cheating is a big taboo in fortress societies, as well as stealing. And then there's revenge killings, which are self-explanatory.
Right.
It basically all boils down to capital punishment, of the sort that you often find in societies today, for better or for worse. Now, when the archaeological record is taken into account, as hard as it is to interpret, what you find is that violence on a large scale, whether you want to call that warfare or not, was probably rare over the long term. It could arise, for sure, but could just as easily peter out. It's all about context. All we can be sure of regarding warfare is this: when sedentary societies begin to emerge, along with all the social stratification, resource hoarding, and land grabbing that comes with it, the conditions for conflict rise dramatically. And it's no surprise that around 15,000 years ago, when sedentary societies were becoming more common around the world, do we find greater evidence of intergroup violence that we could call warfare? But it's not all about fighting. For all those folks who kind of love to emphasize the violence we're capable of, humans are just as easily capable of creating peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that should be emphasized more when talking about so-called human nature,
Right.
whatever that is. In nomadic forager bands, peace was maintained through collective effort by everyone in the community. Again, this is cooperation at its finest. In his 2017 book Behave, neurologist Robert Sapolsky discusses three main values that nomadic foragers tended to share and care about in their societies. One was fairness, so going back to the importance of sharing resources within the community. Two, indirect reciprocity, which in which exchange is given equally to other members of the group, regardless of who initiated it. And three, avoidance of despotism, aka making sure the cheaters and bullies are held accountable for their actions.
Mm.
Now, this last part is very heavily valued in nomadic forager societies. There's always a sense of justice at play here. Despotic folks are treated in a variety of ways, increasing the level of harshness to ensure peace and stability is maintained within the group. So this can be gossip, direct criticism, shaming, shunning, cutting off food during meals,
Mm.
non-lethal punishments, like a good kick in the pants, expulsion from the group, and as a very last resource, death.
Mm.
Sometimes at the hands of the entire group, but occasionally maybe in the hands of a designated executioner.
Mm.
So in this way, life can continue smoothly, and everyone soon learns to value cooperation and compassion, at least for members of their own group.
Mm.
Now, I know I've spent a lot of time here, but before moving on to the Middle and Late Stone Age records themselves, it would be good to talk a little bit about what kinship, marriage, and childhood might have been like for early Homo sapiens forager
Mm.
bands.
Mm.
Now, based on what we see across recent nomadic forager bands, kinship was traced bilaterally, so that is through both parents. That was usually the main way that everyone in the community identified themselves, as part of one large family. And the foundations of new family lines were likely created through an arranged monogamous marriage within the regional band. So, contrary to some popular resources, monogamy isn't really a new thing in the human story. The most parsimonious explanation from cross cultural studies is that monogamy was the norm. Polygamy isn't usually seen in nomadic forager bands, and when it is, it's all extremely context dependent to a particular environmental or cultural condition. Monogamy in these groups has been argued to play a role in keeping social tensions down and preventing intersexual conflicts. As I've explained previously, two dudes fighting over one woman or a woman committing adultery usually means that someone's going to get killed somehow.
Mm. Right.
And the fact that these that these marriages were usually arranged is also important to note. Another key finding across cross-cultural studies is that this form of marriage is another norm for forager societies. It often started when the individuals involved were very young, practically children, but they were not be-all, end-all relationships. Divorce in nomadic forager bands was just as common, and often during first marriages, after which a partner could leave and then choose somebody they actually wanted to be with. And given the universal presence of incest taboos in nearly all human societies, it's not just foragers, but everybody else, people were careful to marry outside their families,
Mm.
at least beyond their first cousins.
Mm.
And so we come to the lives of children in nomadic forager societies. Being a kid 100,000 years ago must have been a drag, right? But not really. Children had rich social lives deep in the past. Far from being just helpers and collecting resources, kids were able to play with toys. They could paint and sculpt alongside their parents. They could interact with other children in ways that helped them prepare for adulthood.
Mm.
Of course, education in nomadic forager societies was very important, and children were encouraged to learn as much as necessary to survive and thrive.
Mm.
Whether it was making stone tools or learning to identify the right plants and animals to eat, children played as much a role in early human life as their parents, which has prompted many anthropologists to lament the lack of coverage of their lives in typical accounts of human evolution, which is a situation that is slowly changing for the
Mm.
better. In fact, I'm reading a new book right now, A Story of Us. It literally just came out this month.
Mm. Mm.
which will hopefully add to my growing knowledge of human origins research. And I hope I can share some of that with you all in the remaining episodes of this series. Um, but yeah, Albert, do you have anything to add about nomadic forager bands?
Not particularly. I think you covered all the bases pretty well here, but it's definitely fascinating to, see kind of some of the similarities that we still retain in our current societies, as different as they may be.
Yeah, and that's a really big. That's a key thing too.
Mm, mm.
To be human is to share a lot of cultural similarities, even if your societies are completely different.
Right, right.
And it makes it a lot easier to empathize with a lot of these peoples, no matter how far in the past they have lived.
Mm, mm,
So let's jump to the next slide now, and let's make another transition from cultural anthropology to archaeology.
mm.
What does the rock record have to say about the African Middle Pleistocene? Well, first of all, in archaeological terms, we have to distinguish between the Middle Stone Age and the Later Stone Age. These were not discrete, neatly separated periods of time, like on a geologic timescale, but instead disproportionate ages of specific technological developments. These stone ages occurred and persisted at different times and in different places, and often at the same time. The only thing constant about them is the fact that the middle and late stone ages usually follow in that sequence between each other in different parts of the world. So, okay, to break things down a bit, the early Stone Age of Africa is reserved for basically all the technological change that occurred since hominins first started constructing stone tools. It goes all the way back to the Longwequian toolkit of 3.3 million years ago. The African Middle Stone Age, which is associated with Homo sapiens and its closest relatives, begins roughly 500,000 years ago in southern Africa, with a gradual change in form of the earlier Acheulean toolkit towards the particular forage-smith industry. And this is also when we start to see human fossils markedly different from erectines like Homo ergaster. Then, by 300,000 years ago, Middle Stone Age toolkits began emerging in eastern Africa. And by 100,000 years ago, they're widespread across the continent. So you can see how, up to that time, there were still humans using early Stone Age toolkits. That's what I meant. There's no specific date in human prehistory where, like, a total early Stone Age ends and a total Middle Stone Age begins. All very gradual. Now, Middle Stone Age toolkits are characterized by an increase in stone point diversity, beyond what was seen in the Acheulean toolkit, which only went very subtle changes in form over longer periods of time than this. As well as the adoption of prepped core methods. That's that level wall technique I mentioned last episode, which the Neanderthals and their relatives were using in Eurasia. Regarding the increase in tool diversity, you can clearly see on the map to the right how many different types of African tools emerged. And I'll talk about some of these in a moment, but first I want to draw attention to the fact that during the later parts of the Middle Stone Age, composite tools started to appear, including what is likely the first use of the bow and arrow by 61,000 years ago, as well as other tools made from organic materials like bone and wood. Now, this, of course, might just be the result of missing samples in the archaeological record. I've discussed in earlier episodes that early hominins were conceivably using wood and bone tools as well.
Right.
And on a related note, aesthetic objects for Homo sapiens first appear in the archaeological record by 100,000 years ago. But again, they were likely being made earlier than that. The biggest aspect that allied the Middle Stone Age with the Early Stone Age, but not the Later Stone Age, was that for all this new diversity in toolkits, technologies, and societies, cultural change was still rather slow. Some of these stone industries persist little change for tens of thousands of years, which certainly says more about their usefulness than anything else. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
Right.
But it's also important to note that during the evolution of Homo sapiens that coincided with the greater parts of the Middle Stone Age, this sort of gradual cultural change was against an enormous shift in ecology. Human environmental plasticity exploded with the emergence of Homo sapiens, and the widespread distribution of associated sites across Africa in deserts, scrublands, grasslands, forests, temperate and tropical, has led some researchers to propose that our species actually initiated a brand new ecological niche, that of the generalist specialist, which means that we're very good at inhabiting different environments and localizing adaptations to those environments with relative ease. This is in contrast with other hominins who had tended to stay within specific ecological regions that didn't require great specialization, open woodlands, for example.
Right.
Now, I'd like to highlight just some of the Middle Stone Age toolkits here, just to kind of give you a sense of the diversity that I was talking about previously. First, we have the Sangoan toolkit, which is named after Sango Bay in Uganda, but is found across Central Africa, which curiously still retains elements of the older Australian technology, save for the lack of teardrop-shaped hand axes. This suggests that the Sangoan probably has links going back a long way, and some sites have been dated roughly 285,000 years old. Like the Australian, these tools are very thick, they're bifacial, and were likely used in a similar manner. Some of the larger ones have evidence of use in digging for roots and tubers, and there's even traces of iron oxides on some of these tools, just a use in mineral extraction. Unlike the Australian, however, Sangoan points show evidence of hafting onto wooden shafts. This is some of the earliest evidence in Africa we have of such practices. Next is the Lupemban toolkit, named after the Lupemba River in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is also prominently a Central African toolkit, very common in the west of the continent. These tools were fairly big, consisting of elongated blades and bifacial points. Some of these could have reached about 21 centimeters in length. Lupemban tools have been dated back about 265,000 years ago, and they share similar uses to the Sangoan, including the fact that they were also halved onto wooden shafts and probably used for digging up vegetable foods. Then we have the Aterian toolkit of northwestern Africa, named after the site of Bel Er Atir in Algeria. These date back only about 145,000 years ago, and the Aterian has such an extensive record across the Western Sahara region, which makes it one of the best records we have of human occupation there. Typical stone points were almost certainly hafted onto shafts, and this process was made especially easy because the people actually crafted these tools and worked the ends into tangs for easier connection. Now, the Aterian toolkit also includes bone tools, of which several have been well preserved and were likely used as knives, incidentally. Lastly, there's the Nubian complex, which I've mentioned previously, thanks to the very recent discovery that the Levantine tools of the Nubian complex were constructed by Neanderthals, and not by Homo sapiens as once thought. Now, the Nubian complex dates back at least 180,000 years ago, and incorporates very clear level wall techniques. Its presence west of the Red Sea, as well as in southwestern Asia, is very interesting. So, were the humans making the Nubian complex in Africa Homo sapiens too? Or were they Neanderthals that actually crossed into Africa? Or was there a center of cultural exchange across the Red Sea between the two regions where both species shared this practice? Time will tell whether any of those scenarios is accurate. Before we move on to highlight a few of the key Middle Stone Age sites, is there anything you'd like to add, Albert?
I don't think so.
All right, let's continue then. On the next slide here, let's start first with the Classes River Caves. These are distributed across 5 systems within the Eastern Cape Province of South Africa. Occupation at the site has been recorded between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, and these caves give us important information about how some of these forager bands utilized food resources. Besides local plant life, the people here made use of very specific marine foods. We find evidence of mollusks, especially limpets, but also mussels and oysters, as well as fur seals and penguins. But very little fish. Despite their locations so close to the beach, the foragers here appear to have been choosy with what animals they caught. Now, the most interesting information, however, concerns their use of inland game animals. The Classes River Cave people seemingly prefer to catch antelope, mostly eland, which I have pictured here on the top, but also hartebeest and grisbok, as well as smaller mammals like the hyrax and Cape porcupine. Now, on occasion, they would go after bush pig and Cape buffalo, a young one of which is seen here at the bottom. But these had to have been formidable prey animals, because when we find their bones in the caves, the individuals are almost always young or very old. The suggestions that these people were choosy with game animals is backed up by the observation that For example, Cape buffalo are actually more common in the area than eland antelope,
Oh,
but
wow.
the latter make up the majority of hoofed mammal kills.
Right.
So that's pretty interesting there. The next site, infamous, Blombos Cave, which is also in South Africa, but in the Western Cape. Prior to the discoveries of Javan Homo erectus, where they were, engraving markings onto mollusk shells, this was the oldest known site for aesthetic imagery associated with any hominid.
Hmm.
The cave itself was occupied at various times by Homo sapiens between 100,000 and 65,000 years ago, but much of the aesthetic materials date to the earliest occupations. Much like the Classes River cave dwellers, the people at Blombos utilized all sorts of plant foods, marine life, and land animals, but it's the cultural materials that have gathered the most attention. The star of Blombos is pictured at the bottom left of the column, a 5.36 centimeter chunk of red ochre engraved with cross hatching marks. This is one of many that have since been found in the cave, but so far their use remains a mystery. Of course, it will always be difficult to interpret aesthetic objects in the archaeological record, but researchers will always try.
Right.
Um, Other aesthetic imagery abounds, including seashell beads that were likely strung on fibers, and you can see the image at the top right, and seemingly abstract cave paintings with red ochre, here in the image at the top left. Also, incidentally, the oldest known for any hominid. And we even have evidence of the possible tools that people use to help create these things. In 2011, a processing workshop was located inside the cave, not a very big one, where at least two upturned abalone shells were found
Hmm.
that were still full of watered down ochre,
Wow.
alongside remains of charcoal, bone, and stone grinding and hammering tools. So clearly, with the combined evidence from our relatives the Neanderthals and the Erectines, human beings on Earth at about this time were exploring the world through aesthetic means. And I do kind of have to laugh a little bit because whenever I read about Blombo's cave, I am immediately reminded of that scene from Adventure Time. I, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about with friggin' Lemon Grab and the three kids who go to live with them, and this is Blumbo.
Oh.
You know, what is that on Blumbo's ears? Take them off.
Oh my goodness.
It's been a hot minute since I've seen that show. I gotta watch it again.
Right, right.
I'm getting a giggling fit thinking about it again. All right, let's move to the next slide then. Um, uh, now, now we leave South Africa a bit, and we're going to head to the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the site of Katanda in the Semliki Valley. So, roughly 90,000 years ago, and possibly at earlier times, a community was living alongside the Proto Semliki River and crafting bone tools to catch big catfishes.
Hmm.
These tools were delicately carved into barbed and unbarbed shapes, with the former resembling the edge of a buzzsaw, which
Hmm.
you can kind of make out in the image here below. Now, given the abundant remains of catfish bones at the site, researchers have suggested that these bone tools were used as harpoons, which may have been attached to spears that the people could have thrust into the water. Now, the last Middle Stone Age site we'll explore right now is Sibidu Cave. So we're going back to South Africa within the KwaZulu-Natal region, variously occupied between 77,000 and 38,000 years ago. This is an important site for understanding the emergence of new technologies among Homo sapiens forager bands. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. In 2018, Lucinda Backwell and colleagues published a paper outlining the results of what they argue is the earliest known evidence for bow and arrow technology in the world. They're about 61,000 years old, and what is known is a refitted bone point, which is 4.93 centimeters in length,
Hmm.
that closely resembles the types of bone arrow points used by neighboring South African foragers.
Hmm.
You can see this here in the image at the bottom left of that particular column, the darker green structures there. Researchers performed experimental archaeology to try to figure out the possible construction strategies used to make a point like this. And the process proved Very easy,
Hmm.
using the exact same methods that South African foragers take when making their bows. Uh, Whittling down a piece of eland bone with a sharp tool, inserting it into a reed shaft with animal sinew, and then making a wooden bow strung with kudu tendon to fire it.
Hmm.
For the most part, the experiment was a success, and the arrow was able to be fired with little problems at select targets. Archaeological remains suggest that a common game animal at the site was the dwiker,
Hmm.
which is small enough to be felled with a bow and arrow pretty quickly.
Right.
Also at the site of Sabidu is the earliest known use of bone needles in the hominin record. Again, a little over 61,000 years old, and I have pictured them there at the right. Um, these needles, the researchers found, also matched those used by South African foragers to work animal hides,
Hmm.
aka we have possible evidence for the manufacture of clothing in the archaeological record. Another neat find, which kind of echoes our discussion from the last episode about early human dwellings,
Hmm.
are the remains of bedding construction. So the oldest remains of these, a little bit older at 77,000 years ago, show that people took sedges and rushes, these grass-like plants, and they laid them out appropriately into beds, and then topped them all with leaves from a plant called Cryptocarya woodii, or Cape Quince. Now, what makes these leaves special here is that they contain chemicals that repel biting insects and their larvae.
Ah.
So the folks who inhabited the cave were able to actually get a good night's sleep without worrying about bugs bothering them,
Wow.
which is very ingenious. All right, before we move on to the later Stone Age, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not too much, but it is very impressive seeing all these sites and these different ways of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, reading about them was
Hmm.
certainly a treasure. Kind of goes to show how much this series has kind of helped me in my own education.
Yeah.
I'm able to help educate you, the viewers, and also educate myself when I look at all these different papers.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah, all the stuff that is just, not usually reported on all that much in popular press.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Alrighty then, let's move on to the next slide here.
Yep.
Um, the African Middle Stone Age had gradually begun to be supplanted by the later Stone Age around 70,000 years ago in Eastern Africa. Changes in technology slowly advanced across the continent, reaching Southern Africa by 48,000 years ago, Central and Western Africa by 32,000 years ago, and finally appearing in the North African record by 25,000 years ago. But there were still some pockets where Middle Stone Age technologies were still used. Again, alluding to our previous discussion. A very recent study, I'm talking back in January, demonstrated its presence in present day Senegal as late as 11,000 years ago. So at the start of the Holocene epoch, people were still using Middle Stone Age tools. Now, Africa's later Stone Age persisted as long as stone tools were the primary technologies used by people,
Mm.
specifically Homo sapiens, because the later Stone Age is completely attributed to our species.
Mm.
In time, within places where metallurgy would emerge on the continent, the later Stone Age is said to end. So, for example, you had the emergence of the Bronze Age along the Nile River around 5,100 years ago, or as West African Bantu speaking agriculturalists spread south and brought iron with them. So, in some places, the later Stone Age didn't end until as late as 700 years ago. Now, a quick aside regarding the later Stone Age in North Africa. Early into its inception, Homo sapiens had already made far steps in their population expansion across Eurasia, and genetic evidence reveals that backward migrations into Africa occurred at various times. Recall the examples from the last episode about the presence of Neanderthal genes in African populations, likely emerging from migrations of European Homo sapiens into Africa sometime after 35,000 years ago. Now, later backward expansions appear to have occurred and are associated with the presence of a later Stone Age technology in the region called the Ibero-Maurusian toolkit, which is found in the Atlas region of Northwest Africa. Tools of this sort show up by 23,000 years ago and are very different from the former Aterian toolkit that was on its way out by this time. Genetic studies on human remains associated with Ibero-Maurusian toolkits reveal that part of their ancestry comes from pre-agricultural peoples from Southwest Asia, likely members of the Natufian culture, whom we'll meet eventually. Now, those skeletal remains are at most 15,000 years old, so this particular backward expansion must have occurred prior to this time. It's possible the Ibero-Maurusian toolkit emerged from a changing society brought about by the new inhabitants from Southwest Asia to the native North Africans that were already living there, but other hypotheses provide equal plausibility. It's just important to note that these same genetic studies also show evidence of West and East African ancestry among the Ibero-Maurusian remains. So it's clear that at least by 15,000 years ago, later Stone Age Africans were involved in a wider world outside of the continent. So what specifically distinguishes the later Stone Age from the Middle Stone Age is the presence of microlithic tools. So that's blades and small flake tools that show up as a new complete shift from older and larger tools. They're very standardized, with geometric shapes that are very easily halved onto wooden implements like spears and harpoons. And it seems clear that, based on the increase in use of microliths at these sites, people were valuing greater sharpness and quick replacement over long-lasting use and durability. And with a change in stone tools came a change in the types of hunts that were occurring during the late Pleistocene. Archaeological evidence points to an increase in larger game being taken, as well as greater specialization in hunting and gathering techniques as a whole. There were parts of Africa where caves, lakes, and riversides were being increasingly used with regularity, and more people were settling down in regions where resources were so abundant that nomadic travel declined, which means that the conditions were ripe for the formation of sedentary societies, which anthropologist Manvir Singh talked about previously. Incidentally, the site of Jebel Shahaba in Sudan provides possible evidence for the types of behavior usually associated with sedentary societies. So between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago, a cemetery was prepared for 61 people of various ages and sexes. About 45% of the people had been killed with spears and arrows. And there's another site in Kenya, Nautaruk, which is dated to the Holocene 10,000 years ago, in which an even grislier scene unfolded. Out of 27 bodies found, 12 of them were not given proper burials, but simply died where they were. And 10 of those bodies showed evidence of being brutally executed.
Oof.
They were bound up by their limbs and then struck over their heads, chests, and arms by blunt objects.
Oh, God.
And some were shot with projectile weapons, some of which the skulls actually still have the points inside of them.
Wow.
So that's, it gives me the heebies.
You're right.
But what this evidence suggests is that the sites where these people lived must have been so resource abundant that the previously nomadic foragers preferred to settle down and claim some ownership of the land. And so neighboring groups, faced with harsher, resource-poor conditions, likely happened upon these sedentary groups and spurred conflicts over territory. In other words, warfare. Now, much of these changes were likely spurred by the onset of the last glacial maximum, around 33,000 years ago, and ending between about 20 and 15,000 years ago, depending on what ice sheets you look at. During that time, Africa had reached peak aridity, turning much of the continent dry. And as the ice sheets retreated, Africa followed a gradual shift to more humid conditions, which created much of the lush, resource-rich environments that some of these human communities sought after. And in a later episode, we'll look at some more. So let's jump to the next slide now. Again, we're going to look at some key later Stone Age sites, and each of these has provided some very interesting clues into the lives of Homo sapiens in Africa. So first, there's the very convenient site called Nazlet Katir 4, which is part of a wider series located in Upper Egypt. I say convenient because this is really one of the only good sites we have of prehistoric Nile communities before the onset of the last glacial maximum. Here, archaeologists have found a 35 to 30,000-year-old quarry where humans produced blade and flake stone tools. The Nile River Valley has seemingly always been a great place for human beings, in the past as well as in more recent times. So to find sites like this suggests that the seeds of the Egyptian and Kushite cultures are planted very deep. Now the next site is Ishango, which is located within the famous Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The people who lived here 25 to 20,000 years ago, a community of primarily fishers, have attracted attention from paleoanthropologists because some of the skeletal remains fall outside the typical range of variation for Homo sapiens. In particular, features of the jaw and inner ear point more towards Middle Pleistocene humans
Huh.
than to present day humans in the same region today. And this has brought up the possibility that this community represents a late surviving population descended from admixture
Hmm.
between Homo sapiens and some other human species.
Hmm.
We'll see another site in a moment that is also related to this. But one curious find from Ishango is a reworked baboon fibula that had been carved with three asymmetrical columns of lines along the bone and embedded with a sharpened piece of quartz at the smaller end. I put a picture of this here at the top of the column.
Hmm.
This single artifact has proven very difficult to interpret ever since its discovery in 1950. One of the most popular hypotheses regards its use as a time counting device.
Ah.
So, some researchers have noted that the lines within the columns come in a particular pattern and that they closely match similar tools among forager groups in Namibia today, in which they're created as calendars. Now, this similarity, it must be stressed, is contested by other researchers,
Hmm.
and for now, it's best kind of not to get too attached to any one hypothesis.
Right.
But still, its presence is fascinating in a cultural context.
Hmm.
And there have been other finds like it in the archaeological record. So the Limbombo bone from southern Africa is 44,000 years old and looks very similar to this. So it's clear that some very interesting things were going on within the prehistoric cultures here.
Hmm.
Speaking of really interesting things, if we go to the next slide,
Yep.
oh yeah, here we
Hmm.
have the Apollo 11 cave from Keetsmanshoop, Namibia. This is dated between 27,500 and 19,500 years ago. And this cave preserves the earliest known figurative paintings and engravings in Africa. The curious name for this site, which you might have seen, supposedly comes from one of its discoverers, Wolfgang Erich Wendt. He was doing archaeological work inside the cave during the successful re entry of the Apollo 11 crew to Earth.
Ah.
So I guess inspiration hit him that day. Now, the aesthetic imagery from Apollo 11 cave comes in two forms. There's a series of 7 quartzite stone slabs with red and white paintings, and there's a number of engravings along the dried up riverbed that have been preserved. Some of the images I've chosen to show here are very clearly motifs of native animals.
Hmm.
So there's a big ostrich here at the far right. At the bottom, there's a kudu,
Hmm.
complete with the characteristic spiral horns. There's also a number of geometric shapes too, patterns and swirls and circles here and there. Um, of the quartzite slabs, one showcases an animal of unknown origin, and that's here at the left. It's been described in the literature as having feline, bovine, and human traits.
Huh.
So what does that mean? Are we looking at a mythological creature, perhaps?
Hmm. Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see.
Right.
Well, on the next slide, um, we're now going to look at Nelson's Bay Cave in the Western Cape of South Africa. This site appears to have been occupied at various times, with the latest instance between 15,000 and 9,000 years ago. Here we have another potential instance of sedentary living, for the people who lived here along the coast were apparently in a situation where resources were so abundant that there was a lesser need to remain nomadic. In fact, as indicated by these shifts towards local rock outcrops for tool manufacture, trading with outside communities actually seems to have gradually ceased.
Hmm.
The Nelson's Bay Cave people were just fine staying here and collecting all the different types of food available to them. We find evidence of fish hooks and nets that were used to catch open ocean fish and seabirds, and the evidence from land based kills suggests that hunters were exceptionally good at taking ever more dangerous prey. There's an increase in wild pigs and cave buffalo remains at the site compared to the minority seen at the earlier Classy's River Cave site.
Hmm.
So that's pretty cool. And the last site we're going to look at for now is Iho Eliru from southwestern Nigeria. I alluded to this site earlier in my discussion of Ishango, because here we have another instance of skeletal remains bearing features seen in Middle Pleistocene humans. Now, what's amazing about this find, however, is the age of these bones, around 16,300 to 11,700 years ago, right on the border of the Holocene.
Right.
If there's a similar case here, where these people were the result of admixture between Homo sapiens and earlier human species, then that has great implications for the
Hmm.
deep population history of Africa.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, maybe some of these now extinct species survived for far longer than anywhere else in Afro-Eurasia,
Hmm.
longer than the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Again, more evidence would be needed to be sure, but it's very tantalizing.
Hmm.
Albert, do you have anything to add about these later Stone Age sites?
Not really, but they're all really interesting, that's for sure.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to the next slide, and we're in the home stretch now. Um, it wouldn't feel appropriate to leave our discussion of the African Stone Age without looking a little bit at some of the people who've managed to hold on to much of the cultural and technological achievements
Hmm.
all the way into the present day.
Right.
Um, that's not to say, of course, that these peoples are remnants of the prehistoric past
Hmm.
or that they're Stone Age people stuck in the 21st century, because that is not true.
Right.
The preservation of ancient traditions does not preclude adaptations to more recent conditions. Everyone on Earth shares the same ancestors, remember, and we've all had the same amount of time to grow and change and adjust to our environments
Hmm.
and ourselves. Surviving forager groups have been able to help us understand the past, but they also tell us about our present day.
Hmm.
True nomadic forager societies, completely reliant on the tools they make and carry themselves, are gone. The people I'm going to talk about are in part descendants of those same nomadic foragers, but they're also the descendants of many thousands of years of introduced agriculture and industrialization
Hmm.
from neighboring peoples. And many of these people still practice foraging and know how to make many of the same tools, but they're also reliant on agricultural and metal products, which they've learned to make themselves, which they trade with other peoples, or which they acquire from government programs. Let's go ahead and meet some of them. On the leftmost photo is a community of Central African foragers called the Mbuti. Much of the ancestry of these peoples dates back very early, as the Central African foragers make up one of the five major lineages that emerged during our species' origin. Genetic studies show that these peoples once had a very wide range across the Congo Basin, until conditions changed around 18,000 years ago, and the overall population diverged into about two geographical groups in the east and the west. Now, as Bantu and Nilo-Saharan speaking agriculturalists began expanding their populations into the Congo Basin around 5 to 4,000 years ago, they came in contact with these Central African foragers in dramatic and very complex ways. There's evidence of extensive genetic admixture between the two, and whatever languages they originally spoke have been heavily changed, so that now most of their language contains Bantu and Nilo-Saharan elements. In some instances, relations were stable. Agriculturalist groups often traded with Central African foragers, exchanging vegetable foods for hunted game. And sometimes there were cases where foragers were recruited by the Bantu and Nilo-Saharan peoples as scouts for hunts,
Hmm.
or even as outlookers of incoming attacks from warring neighbors.
Hmm.
In other instances, however, relations were poor,
Hmm.
and many Central African foragers ended up as slaves to agriculturalist groups. In the present day, the descendants of these encounters make up about 900,000 people, divided into three geographical groups. You have the Eastern Mbuti, the Western Mbanga, and the Southern Twa. Now, in the traditional literature, you'll often find that these peoples are referred to as pygmies,
Hmm.
which is a term that derives from the ancient Greek word for dwarf. Now, this is today a pejorative word among the people it describes. They hate it. And so we do well to stop using it.
Hmm.
It turns out, incidentally, that the characteristic short stature, on average about 1.4 meters tall, is actually likely a convergent trait among the different ethnic groups of Central African foragers.
Hmm.
This shorter height evolved over time, likely as an adaptation towards reproduction. The relative heat and humidity of the Congo Basin means that keeping cool becomes difficult at a certain height, not to mention that harmful diseases are common. By having genes that cut off growth hormones before around age 16, which is when reproductive age for Central African foragers kicks in, you can prevent your bodies from overheating
Hmm.
and you can keep diseases at bay before you give birth to your babies.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, it turns out disease is still a difficult thing here. The average Umbuti or Umbenga is a third less likely to survive past reproductive age than their agriculturalist neighbors.
Wow.
Now, today, these people still maintain relationships with agricultural peoples. They depend heavily on crops like rice, potatoes, cassava, and peanuts for their daily carbohydrates. And they provide game and other rainforest foods to the farmers, things like honey. In one of these nations, the Ife, who are members of the Eastern Mbuti that live in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the relationships with their Lise speaking farmer neighbors are quite multifaceted. For example, it is generally established among the Lise that their men can marry Ife women, but never the other way around. It's treated as a taboo. Various accounts depict the feelings between the two peoples on the one hand as friendly and mutually beneficial, while on the other hand as selfish and scheming.
Hmm.
So it's sort of in the air how the two groups actually feel about one another, because different accounts have provided different responses. In general, the Central African foragers continue to deal with great struggles, from continued slavery by certain Bantu speaking farmers to annual deforestation
Hmm.
by neo-colonial powers, to repeated discrimination by both neighboring peoples and supervising governments.
Hmm.
And the overall population is in decline due to issues like disease and outright genocide. FSA Le Tableau being the most infamous from 2002 to 2003.
Hmm.
Thankfully, though, human rights groups have recognized the harm being done and have continued to help fight for these peoples, who themselves have also made many attempts to assert their rights to life in the Congo Basin. Now, the next group I'd like to highlight are the Hadza and the Sandawe of Tanzania. These peoples have been extensively studied by anthropologists for many years because they represent the last nomadic forager groups in Eastern Africa. Based on genetic studies, in prehistory, their range appears to have also been much more widespread, and there's evidence of extensive admixture with Khoisan speaking peoples to the south prior to 35,000 years ago. The languages spoken by the Hadza and the Sandawe are considered isolates, but they do share some similarities with Khoisan languages, in particular the click consonants. But in general, linguists today don't see it as accurate to classify them all in the same language family.
Hmm.
There's probably cases of cognition being going on here. As with the Central African foragers, population expansions from outside peoples, Bantu agriculturalists, as well as East African pastoralists, have reduced their range and admixed with them to varying degrees. Today, the Hadza make up around 1,300 people, and the Sandawe number about 76,000. Both groups have retained their knowledge of nomadic foraging, although most today live in agricultural villages and even marry into non Hadza families. Actually, around 3 to 400 Hadza today retain a regular nomadic lifestyle, moving from place to place, building temporary shelters, constructing bow and arrows by hand, collecting wild plants, and hunting for game, while also accepting handouts from outsiders. However, much of the interest to the Hadza by the outside world, in part thanks to anthropologists, has brought difficult changes to their place in the world.
Hmm.
Over the past 50 years, something like 75 to 90% of the Hadza ancestral homeland has been lost due to pressures from agricultural and industrial peoples. Tourism has continuously encroached upon the Hadza and uprooted traditional lifestyles that had kept relations stable among the families. The Sandawe similarly have faced pressures on their way of life, and by the time that European colonists arrived in their lands, the Sandawe had fully added agricultural and pastoralist practices into their daily lives while still hanging on to traditional forager knowledge. Um, One great story of triumph by the Hadza, in particular, concerns a situation in 2006 when the Al Nahyan royal family from the United Arab Emirates tried to buy ancestral Hadza lands in the name of making a personal hunting reserve.
Hmm.
The family had made a deal with the Tanzanian government without any real consultation from the Hadza themselves. In fact, a few of them who participated at the government meeting were forcibly silenced,
Hmm.
and two were arrested for protesting the decision. Now, the move proceeded as planned, and both the Hadza and the Datunga pastoralists, who also shared the region with them, were all evicted.
Damn.
Um, yeah, continued protests by the Hadza continued for several months, and soon the story caught the attention of the international media, who responded very harshly, and rightly so. And this combined fight proved to be very effective. And the following year, the deal was broken, and the lands returned to the people who were living there.
Hmm.
So that is just wonderful to hear. Now, the last people I'd like to talk about are probably the most familiar of the surviving African foragers, and that's the Bushmen of the Kalahari region of South Africa, which presently number about 100,000 people. Now, using the word Bushmen to describe these people, I open up a whole can of worms
Hmm.
regarding proper terminology.
Right.
And this is something we'll see again when we talk about the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In the traditional literature, the word Bushman was frequently used, but by the 1990s, the word San was increasingly preferred in anthropological circles.
Hmm.
Both of these are in contrast with their designation as RADs, or remote area dwellers, by supervising governments. But like this name, the former two stemmed from outside origins. Bushmen derived from the Dutch settlers in the 1600s, while San derived from the neighboring Khoikhoi pastoralists, who share a click-based language family with them
Hmm.
and coexisted alongside them for a very long time. In his recent book, Affluence Without Abundance, anthropologist James Sussman brings up the interesting fact that while both terms originated as pejorative slang, the forager groups of the Kalahari actually tended to prefer the term Bushman over that of San,
Hmm.
with some even taking it as a badge of honor.
Huh.
It kind of outlines that, yes, we are the Aboriginal peoples of these lands. So, in the interest of being respectful, I am going to follow suit and use Bushman here. But I must also specify that disagreement still remains among both the people themselves and the outside community that works with them.
Hmm.
And I will absolutely change the terms I use whenever necessary. So, Khoisan speaking peoples have a very long history. Alongside these Central African foragers, the majority of their ancestry dates back to a lineage that emerged towards the origin of Homo sapiens. They have a rich genetic diversity, despite evidence of population declines around 100,000 years ago, associated with extreme droughts, and in part due to extensive admixture with other peoples. Despite their association with traditional foraging behaviors, the Bushmen have cohabitated their lands with pastoralist groups for about 2,000 years, and with agriculturalist groups for 1,500 to 700 years, with different degrees of success. Relations have been peaceful, as evidenced by stable partnerships with cattle herding groups, as well as conflicting. So the spread of the Zulu nation during the early 1800s brought up a lot of harm to these communities.
Hmm.
Now, while some of the Bushmen have responded to these changes by settling down and taking up agriculture, many still remain and retain nomadic forager lifestyles in relative isolation. The Kalahari region is notorious for its harsh conditions. It's dry, hot, and dusty. But the Bushmen who live here have managed to survive and adjust with the times. Numerous ethnographic studies across the 1950s, 60s, and 70s had offered conflicting views of their societies, and depending on the anthropologist, the Bushmen were either a people who lived in a land of relative abundance and security, or a people who knew difficulty and starvation intimately. And it's very likely that the lives of the Bushmen underwent periodic boom and bust cycles, depending on conditions. But thankfully, the retention of traditional foraging techniques has allowed them to weather even the harshest droughts. Archaeologists have been indebted to the Bushmen for their indigenous knowledge, and many of the sites unearthed stretch back tens of thousands of years have yielded artifacts that look virtually the same as the tools that living Bushmen have constructed. In one really cool instance, and I kick myself because I never wrote down the name of the book
Hmm.
that I read this in. A Bushman was invited to this one dig site that was full of all these forager technologies, and he was able to just pick them all up and say what they were and how they were used, as if he was looking at candy in a store. Is amazing. Of course, the relationship between anthropologists and the Bushmen has not always been fair, and these people have realized this. Years of abuse, disrespect, and lack of consultation or support by some anthropologists has led to the establishment of the San Code of Research Ethics in 2017 by the Bushmen themselves. The central statement of the code is as follows, asking, and I quote here, researchers to treat the San respectfully and refrain from publishing information that could be viewed as insulting. Because such sensitivities may not be clear to researchers, the code asks that scientists let communities read and comment on findings before they are published. It also asks that researchers keep their promises and give something back to the community in return for its cooperation. Now, this is a wonderful and timely document and should absolutely be understood well by researchers wanting to work with the Bushmen. And it further demonstrates another powerful resistance to injustice by indigenous communities. So, in discussing these peoples, it's important to re-emphasize that the living foragers of Africa are not remnants of the past, trapped in a world of agriculture and industry, but have had an extensive and interconnected history with neighboring peoples for thousands of years. Knowledge, land, and hands in marriage have been exchanged between these peoples and influenced how they live today. You know, true nomadic foragers solely dependent on resources from uncultivated land are long gone, but the people who inherited their traditions are still here, and they continue to fight for their rights as fellow human beings in the 21st century. Albert, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not especially. When it comes to modern human cultures, we're kind of pretty far outside the scope of my knowledge, unfortunately. But that is one reason why I'm glad that you are taking the time to highlight them and their current struggles.
I appreciate hearing that, Albert. And it's been important for me to learn about these struggles too. A lot of these conflicts I had never heard about before. I mean, like, the way our current news media runs, events outside the U.S.
Right.
And maybe some of our closest, country neighbors and partners is usually not discussed all that much.
That's right. Yeah.
And you kind of have to dig to learn that these, successes and injustices are happening in the first place. So I hope I've been able to kind of provide some of that information to all of you listening today.
Indeed.
And with that will end our discussion of Stone Age Africa. If we go to the next slide, we have the preview for what's coming up next. And we're in for a big worldwide adventure. In a series of population expansions, Homo sapiens has managed to settle across the planet, from the glacial landscapes of Europe to the Central Asian steppes, to the outback of Australia and the rainforests of South America. In many instances, reaching parts of the world where hominins had never ventured before. We're going to follow these great journeys across tens of thousands of years and try to understand how nomadic foragers adapted to such different conditions. As with this episode, we'll also take some stops along the way to see how human biology and culture changed and led to the beginnings of our reign as a global species.
Exciting.
So that's next time on our show. As always, we'd like to thank our friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to our series. Henry providing the wonderful music, and Alicia the color scheme for Albert's avatar. And I'd like to give a special thanks again to Veal Sinkonen for allowing me to use his extinct African ruminant sketches in this episode. We'll be sure to link to his Twitter in the description below.
Yeah, he's a great paleo artist.
Yeah, please go check him out. He's absolutely talented, and he has a very good grasp of animal anatomy and has created some really breathtaking imagery. So you don't want to miss that for sure. And you don't want to miss our Twitter @TimeandClades, where you can follow us for updates. And of course, you might be watching it on our YouTube page through Time and Clades, where we have playlists set for all of our individual series, as well as our new shows. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to send us an email, timeandclades@gmail.com, or you can type a comment below. And as always, extensive links to references are provided in the description. And you can read more about Africa's history for yourself. And then next week, I believe we go back to your bird series, Albert. Is that correct?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, that's right. So in the next episode of my series, we're going to continue looking at kind of the big water bird clade, which has diversified into a variety of aquatic predatory forms of birds. So in particular, we're going to look at things like the storks and herons and boobies and cormorants and pelicans and some of their other relatives too. So they together span a great variety in ways of hunting in aquatic environments.
Oh, I look forward to joining you in for that one. Um, but until then, again, thank you all so much for the huge flood of views and subscriptions.
Mm-hmm.
We hope we can continue to provide really great educational and entertaining content for all of you about our natural world and the species that live within it.
Yep. Mm.
And we hope to see you next week. Until then, take care, everyone.
Have a good one.